Well, welcome everyone to the campus of Southern Methodist University, and welcome to our Columns to Characters Conference. I'm Sandy Dewey. I am chair of the Division of Communication Studies, and we are one of several sponsors of today's events. Dr. Rita Kirk, please raise your hand. Dr. Kirk is director of the Carrie McGuire Center for Ethics and Public Responsibility, also a sponsor of this conference. Next to her, Dr. Jeffrey Engel, director of the Center for Presidential History. Tony Peterson, chair of the Division of Journalism, also a sponsor of the conference, and Mr. Robert Mung, editor, here we are, of the Dallas Morning News. Thank you so much for your sponsorship. We also have some special guests. I would like to recognize Ms. Jean Tower Cox. Please stand. A member of the SMU Board of Trustees. Carrie McGuire himself, the namesake for our Center for Ethics and Public Responsibility. Thank you, Carrie. And Alan Lowe. Alan, are you still with us? Oh. Director of the George W. Bush Presidential Library. As you can imagine, as you peruse our program for the day, a lot of time and effort and planning went into getting such a distinguished panel and group of presenters and guests and speakers together. And this morning, we will first hear from Thomas DeFrank and Olivier Knox, who will kick off the conference. You can find their bios on our website. And now I invite Mr. DeFrank and Mr. Knox to please come forward and give us an overview of the conference. Please join me in welcoming them.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm very happy I came down on Saturday because had I not come down on Saturday, I almost certainly would not be here at the moment. And since I'm from Texas, I'm really thrilled to be back here. I once heard Henry Kissinger begin a speech by saying, of a very fulsome introduction, "That's an introduction I so rarely receive and so richly deserve." Or at least I think I heard Kissinger say that. But maybe his deputy, Brent Scowcroft, just told me Kissinger used to use that line. It's hard to be certain after 40 years. Maybe I heard it, maybe I didn't, you get the drift of where I'm heading on this. But at any rate, lots of people around here know I would never deserve an introduction so fulsome. Some of them are colleagues in this room from Washington. One of them is a retired local guy whose office is not far from here on campus. In the fall of 1999, having announced he was running for president, Governor George W. Bush of Texas was campaigning in Massachusetts. I'd been covering him since 1987, well before he was governor, much less president, so I flew up to Boston to join the roadshow for a day. He greeted me warmly and then introduced me to the governor of Massachusetts as a fellow Texan and, quote, a good man for his ilk. His emphasis was clearly more focused on ilk than good. Whatever, a reporter of my ilk is really happy to be home today. Growing up here, I spent many a Saturday afternoon at Texas A&M SMU games at the Cotton Bowl, almost always disappointed in the outcome. But I'm happy to be on the hilltop today and really appreciate this invitation. When Jeff Engel asked me to speak almost 18 months ago, he said he wanted me to talk about the old days of presidential interaction with the media. He wanted some historical context and institutional memory in counterpoint to much of what you're going to hear today about the amazing opportunities available to contemporary presidents with the explosion of social media. So I said to Jeff, so you want me to be the dinosaur? Which was fine by me. I've been looking forward to doing this for a long time. Now I start here with a photograph. This is a photo of President Calvin Coolidge with White House photojournalists in the 1920s. And I should note, in my defense, that I am not in that picture. It's not true that I've been reporting from Washington since dinosaurs roamed the earth. It is true that my tenure as a White House correspondent is now in its 6th decade, something my 19-year-old Colgate freshman believes is a conspicuously dubious achievement. But my first presidential trip was with Lyndon Johnson in the summer of 1968 as a Newsweek intern. It's also true that from a communications perspective, I definitely date back to prehistoric times, as in pre-internet, pre-cable, pre-iPhone, pre-Facebook, pre-Twitter, pre-Flickr, pretty much pre-everything. Everybody remembers FDR's fireside chats, but even with the advent of television, communicating was still a challenge for presidents. I remember being cleared into the White House in June of 1968 for the very first time and directed to the West Wing entrance. That's where a Marine stands today. It's also where reporters arrived in those days and made their way to a cramped, stuffy press area with tiny cubicles and phone booths. Here's some old pictures. This area is now where the National Security Advisor and his aides are situated, in the northwest corner of the West Wing. But in those days, it was a very scruffy, scrubby, cramped press area for reporters. Look very carefully here, and over several pictures here, you will see things that you don't see anymore. Cigarettes, rotary dial telephones, old-fashioned phone booths for reporters, and manual typewriters, not to mention, regrettably, very few women reporters. This press area was still there when I was cleared into the White House in 1968 for my first briefing, but there was no briefing room. Actually, it was Press Secretary George Christian's office, now occupied by Josh Earnest. 24 reporters, maybe. No cameras, no photographers. I don't remember a steno for transcripts. Some reporters sat on the floor because there weren't enough chairs. That's where business got conducted all the time. I don't know why these are not working, but we'll keep, oh, here we go. There you see some cigarettes. This was just how scruffy it used to be. Sometimes when President Johnson wanted to make some news, he'd wander into the West Wing reception area where reporters were allowed to congregate. You can't go in there now without being cleared by somebody, but reporters set up shop there when it was just too cramped in this briefing area I mentioned before. Sometimes when LBJ wanted to make news, he'd wander into the West Wing reception area, and he'd quickly be surrounded by a captive audience, eager to hear whatever he wanted to deliver to them. It's hard to believe he had to resort to that manner to seek out reporters to get his message out. My friend Peter Mayer of CBS News retired at the end of last year after a quarter century as a White House colleague. At his farewell salute by the White House Correspondents Association in December, Peter told of being on an Obama trip a few months earlier. He was sitting a row behind a couple of Obama press aides on the press bus. He heard one of them say, "Can you imagine what it must have been like for these guys before cell phones?" Peter couldn't resist. He leaned forward and he said, "Yeah, dimes," as in, when you were traveling, you needed to carry a roll of dimes with you and scope out the nearest payphones so you could file in a hurry if you had to. Dimes. Contrast that with last fall's presidential trip to Asia, where the press tab was $90,000 to $100,000 per journalist. That's nearly $1 million dimes, but that's another story. Todd Gilman and Stacia can tell you more about that if you're interested. Many of us also remember from that era reporting a story somewhere in the heartland and pecking it out on a manual typewriter in a bar or hotel room at the end of a long day. Then you had to dial a toll-free number in Omaha or someplace and dictate to a Western Union operator for 45 minutes in the middle of the night. Now, of course, you push a button, it's there. When presidents traveled, it was a little easier. A Western Union representative went along on the press plane to file stories. When you went abroad, there were a couple of reps, but it still might take hours for your copy to make it to the home office. It was slow, it was frustrating, and it wasn't much easier, and definitely not any faster for presidents to get their message out. Here is a story lost in time. On the evening of May 12th, 1975, Cambodian troops seized an American merchant tanker named the Mayaguez in international waters off the coast of Cambodia. I was in the White House at 6:45 a.m. the next morning for Ron Nessen's unusually early White House briefing. Nessen issued a statement on President Ford's behalf, making clear the U.S. considered the seizure of the Mayaguez an act of piracy and demanding its return. Then he pointedly encouraged reporters to halt the briefing and go file, twice. Now, I'm going to anticipate a couple of questions, and then you need to go file, Nessen said. Reporters didn't take the hint, so a couple of minutes later, Ron said more directly, "Why don't you go file?" The transcript doesn't record what happens yet. Next. Nessen went off the record to say the White House had reason to believe the bad guys were reading the wire services and listening to the hourly network radio broadcasts, newscasts. And he wanted these bad guys to see and hear the statement he had just released by President Ford immediately. Specifically, the White House wanted these guys to know the U.S. already had military forces in the area, and we knew exactly where the ship was thanks to satellite intelligence information. The hope was at the Ford White House that maybe the insurgents would think twice about squaring off with the Pentagon when faced with the reality of military action. They didn't take the hint. 2 days later, U.S. Marines and other military forces recaptured the Mayaguez, freed the crew. But can you imagine the fastest way to get that message out to the bad guys that day in May of 1975 was to make sure it got on the 7 a.m. network radio news shows. Talk about snail mail. Now, here's another picture. As Olivier will know, as all of us from Washington will know, this is just a picture of a nondescript wall in the briefing room behind where the 49 chairs are where the briefing is conducted every day. This is where Fox News has its booth these days. Right in the middle to the right of that coat rack is a spot where the bins were located, the very famous bins. For years and years, right here, there were about a dozen brown wooden bins into which press assistants would drop announcements, press releases, advisories, the president's schedule, and all manner of paper throughout the day. I can still remember some press assistant announcing on the intercom, "Now in the bins is a statement from the president on the election in Madagascar." Or "Now in the bins is a transcript of the president's remarks to the governors." Or "Now in the bins is a list of officials accompanying the vice president to the funeral of the Spanish prime minister." I know a reporter who donated his papers to his alma mater, and they included more than 50,000 pages of paper from the bins. Of course, it's absolutely primeval now, but in those days the bins were a lifeblood of presidential communication. You often had to hang around the briefing room more than any mortal should have to, so you didn't miss something important dropped into the bins later in the day, which was a typical presidential trick. Bin duty late in the day was an unappetizing chore reserved for junior reporters and interns like me, but it was important. Until the White House declared a lid for the day, you never knew what information might show up in the bins. There's a great story about Bill Clinton dropping his controversial pardon list in the bins at 10 o'clock the night before he left office, figuring nobody would see them. Very few people saw them, but a couple of people got tipped. Television was a major leap forward, of course. Presidents could command the airwaves more or less whenever they wished. It was rare for the networks to deny a president precious primetime minutes for an address to the nation, but they couldn't always do that too often or risk being charged with exploiting the media for political purposes. And other opportunities to disseminate their spin were limited. Except for the wire services, there were two news cycles, the Today Show AM news cycle and another for the evening news shows, Huntley Brinkley and others, Walter Cronkite. The September morning President Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. In 1974, White House regulars received phone calls at home around 9 in the morning saying there would be a rare Sunday briefing in a couple of hours and we would probably want to be there. Press office staffers divided up the roster of correspondents, a couple hundred, 150, and laboriously went down their list notifying regulars. It was slow and it was tedious, and today, of course, a single advisory would reach throughout the universe in nanoseconds. CNN changed everything forever. Suddenly there was a 24-hour news cycle demanding an insatiable amount of content that presented presidents with more opportunities to reach the masses. And the world as we old-timers knew it changed forever on February 13th, 2010. That's when Robert Gibbs, Obama's first press secretary, opened a Twitter account. It wasn't long before he was making news via tweet. And of course, there's no going back now. Last August, Pentagon spokesman John Kirby used a tweet to announce the resumption of U.S. airstrikes in Iraq for the first time since American troops had left that troubled land 3 years before. Nobody was surprised to see President Obama preview his speech to the nation about his immigration executive order in a Facebook video last November. These things are tips of the iceberg in presidential communication via social media, a technique which this White House has embraced wholeheartedly to take its message around the mainstream media and also aggressively monitor what we all write and broadcast. For as long as I can remember, every president and his handlers have tried to bypass regular reporters and use emerging technology to transmit their messages unfiltered. That's not new. This operation has been far more aggressive and sophisticated at this game. That's where my colleague Olivier Knox takes over with chapter and verse. But before I finish, here's one last picture of the way it used to be. Jerry Ford perched on the edge of his Oval Office desk, surrounded by reporters. Helen Thomas of United Press International, right in the middle, Fran Lewin of the Associated Press, to the far right, the great, late Al Sullivan of the U.S. Information Agency, and others. We'll not see that again, alas. Actually, President Obama was perched on the edge of his desk just like this not long ago in November, but he was doing it as a video for Facebook. And there you have it, a metaphor for the ages in the changes in presidential communication. Olivier, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen and fellow members of The Filter. It's good to be here. As Tom pointed out, it's now a given, really, that social media, places like Twitter and Facebook, and new media, places like Yahoo News, which is where I work now, have changed the how of Americans getting their who, what, where, when, and why, and therefore how the White House communicates with Americans. I'm going to talk a little bit about how it's true, how it's less true, and when it really has to be taken with a grain of salt. The filter, the mainstream media, the lamestream media, the MSM, whatever you want to call us, is in perpetual crisis. The Gallup poll from September 2014 found that something like 40% of Americans trust us to report the news fully accurately and fairly. We're better off than the federal government in that respect. Only 24% of Americans say they trust Washington to get it right. That's still not great. And that mistrust, there's a chicken and egg problem with the rise of social and new media. But I would argue that it has certainly fed Americans' appetite for new outlets, new points of view, new voices. The rise of social media came with this weird utopian idea that everyone was going to be a reporter now. I mean, it's citizen reporter. Everyone can publish. The playing field has been leveled. If you're a doctor angry about a bad newspaper piece about heart disease, you no longer have to send off a letter to the editor and hope that the same outlet that screwed up is now going to let you say in their pages that they screwed up. You can now put up a blog post, put out a tweet, notify all your friends on Facebook that this outlet has made a mistake. And so for a while, that seemed pretty good, right? The 2000 and 2004 elections saw a rise of weblogs, blogs, some of them expressly designed to counter us, those of us in the filter. The Dan Rather affair was a classic, maybe the best example of this, in which you had a handful of bloggers taking down the star anchor of a traditional outlet. What the utopians didn't really think about, though, was that anyone can publish also applies to extremely powerful institutions with large constituencies, like the White House. It's the opposite of idealized citizen journalism. It's a way for the White House, any White House, to escape accountability and the adversarialism that we're supposed to bring to a process of looking under the hood of a policy, kicking the tires, if you'll forgive such a non-tech analogy. So on what scale? I asked the good folks at Twitter back in January to give me some data on the size of the White House's audience. The slide that you have, the only thing you really need to worry about is the word impressions. And impressions really is a fancy way of saying views. Okay, so if you watch the State of the Union, then you probably remember the moment when President Obama said, "I have no more campaigns to run." Republican cheers. He followed it up with, "I know because I won both of them." Democratic cheers. Now that did smell to me like a very well orchestrated ambush, but let's set that aside for a second. The White House saw that moment and they turned around and they put it on Twitter. And that's the top thing you have up there. So 900,000 views. Just to put that into perspective, that's slightly smaller than the LA Times Sunday circulation. It's a big audience. I was talking to my friend Jake Tapper recently, and he really astutely pointed out a couple of years ago that this is a White House that loves to cover itself. They photograph themselves and they put the results on Flickr. They film themselves and post lavishly produced videos on YouTube and Facebook. They record themselves and give us sound clouds on Twitter. You don't have to worry about the technical terms here. Just the point here is that the White House has essentially become a competitor to the mainstream media. So how do we get here? Well, from a historical point of view, the so-called filter hasn't always filtered. Tom mentioned the fireside chats, right? That's an example of the media putting its means entirely in the hands of a president to deliver a message that isn't really commented upon in real time, it's just the president speaking. But this is something different, and I want to touch on a signal moment in this evolution or revolution. I'm going to do something that's been reasonably popular with the Obama administration. I'm going to blame George W. Bush. So the Bush White House did something pretty radical. They had drawn this big audience to the White House website with a video tour of the Oval Office given by the president himself. But what they did around Christmas 2002 transformed the media landscape forever. Is Jimmy Orr here? Okay, well, he was my best hope for getting an easy answer from the crowd. Anybody remember what happened Christmas time, right around Christmas time 2002? Martha, you know. Barney Cam. You guys remember Barney Cam? Okay, so the White House released a digital video of the White House at Christmas as seen through the eyes of the presidential dog. What did major television networks do with the video? Anybody remember? Yeah, they aired it live. Think about that for a moment. They broadcast material that was produced entirely by the White House. Not a photo from some pivotal national security meeting in the Situation Room where you would expect the media to be excluded. No, a lighthearted video produced by the government to showcase the decorations of the White House at Christmas. Now, this to me is the true beginning of the era we're in now of government as media competitor. And what a competitor. The Obama White House doesn't just cover itself. It excludes traditional media to give itself exclusive content. When President Obama hosted Governor Romney for the traditional post-election meeting in early 2003, there were no news photographers in the room. Instead, one of the official White House photographers got what I hesitate to call a scoop. And they released that photo on Flickr. Now, just a quick note, Yahoo owns Flickr, so it actually doesn't hurt my bottom line very much when they do this. But for news photographers at the White House who are increasingly excluded from news events for arbitrary reasons, only to have the White House then release its own photo press release, because to be honest, they're not as interested in the news as they are in making the president look good. It's been an enormous impact. When the president announced his community college tuition plan in a video on Facebook, it became the most watched White House produced video. The last piece of data I have for that is about 8,198,949 views. Again, this is a big audience. This is not a small side project. And the filter has had to scramble to catch up. And that's just content that the White House produces. They've also been adept at turning to non-traditional outlets. Think of those 3 YouTube celebrities who recently interviewed the president. Or think of outlets like Vox or BuzzFeed that didn't exist a few years ago and are now getting sit-downs with the commander-in-chief. The president did a funny video for BuzzFeed recently, last week, I think. At its core was a message to sign up for Obamacare, but he played along, actually amazingly played along with the BuzzFeed ethos. Made faces in a mirror, took a photo of himself with a selfie stick. But the core message was sign up for Obamacare. I just got an email from someone at BuzzFeed. I asked them, so how well did that do? 48 million views so far. This is not a small audience. This is not a side project. This is central to the White House operation now. Now, that's led to some triumphalism from the White House. You'll see senior Obama aides crow, we no longer need the filter. We can go right to the intended audience. You guys are almost irrelevant. Well, there are a lot of reasons to be very, very skeptical about those claims. First is that traditional media moments still have a lot of weight on the political calendar. Even with declining ratings, the State of the Union is a huge, huge night. What has changed, though, is how the White House packages the State of the Union. They think that they have 4 audiences. They have the people in the room and those watching it live on television. So you need an engaging speech for that. Second category is people who are watching on their laptops or on their tablets. And the White House, for those people, adds a lot of interactive graphics. So if you're intrigued by that line, you can click on something and you'll get more information. 3, the 2-screen watchers. Now these are fun. The 2-screen watchers are the people watching it on TV but reading Twitter, for example, or Facebook, to see what their friends and people they follow think about the speech. So for them, the White House has to actually engage individual Twitterers at times and say, no, that's not what he meant, or yes, good point, and things like that, to give them a more interactive experience. And then 4, you have people who are never going to watch the speech, but they're going to consume it through either highlights from advocacy groups. So for example, someone who's very concerned about climate change might not watch the speech, but might go to the National Resources Defense Council and see what they said about it. And the White House, for those folks, has to produce shareable graphics, engaging sound bites and the like that people can consume after the fact. The second reason for skepticism is pretty obvious. It was true before the rise of the internet. Can you tell from the size of an audience whether that audience likes your message? You can't. And based on just my Facebook feed, I would say that people are as likely to share the latest White House video whether they're engaged or enraged. And in fact, what we find when we look at social media, we find that people share things that make them angry a lot. It's not just aw kittens, it's also darn it, what's he done again? So it's very hard to gauge how positively the message is being received. Third is less obvious. You don't see it, I do every day though. Former White House press aide Reed Sherlin inadvertently did us a favor a while back when he wrote in a long piece for Rolling Stone that the White House uses 3 outlets to make news. And those outlets are Politico's Playbook, which could not be more inside the Beltway. The Associated Press could not be more traditional. And the New York Times. Okay, those are the 3 main outlets that they use to release news. Now, there are some exceptions, like the community college tuition announcement, the immigration announcement, things like that. But the White House cares and cares deeply about what traditional news reporters do and say. And that takes us into the daily reality of the White House and social media. New media groups, outlets like Yahoo News, like BuzzFeed and others, and social media means online spaces like Facebook and Twitter where you're talking to your friends, your family, your colleagues. The White House knows that Facebook drives a lot of traffic. People are more likely to read a news story that one of their Facebook friends, so family, neighbors, colleagues, classmates, found, again, enjoyable or enraging. Twitter does drive traffic, but this White House treats it mostly as an early warning system. And in May of last year, I wrote a story called When the White House Hates Your Tweet. I'm going to count on all of you to find it on your phones, laptops, and tablets. I'm not going to recapitulate the whole thing here. Just trust me, it was fun, informative. You're going to want to click on it. But I'm going to give you some of the main points. The White House has a young media aide whose title is Media Monitor, and whose job includes watching the White House press corps' tweets. When, it was a she, I don't know who it is now, but when that staffer sees a problematic tweet, and problematic means an influential reporter panning one of the president's speeches or policies or announcements, the Media Monitor forwards that problematic tweet to about 80 senior administration officials, including the Chief of Staff, the White House counsel, and the press secretary. The White House sees Twitter as the point of origin now for PAC journalism. Individual reporters can't possibly compete with the White House's 4.8 million followers on Twitter, but the last thing they want is for the media to rally around something that they don't want. So a good example, that famous first debate with Mitt Romney. As senior advisor Dan Pfeiffer has put it, they knew it wasn't going well watching it on TV, but when they pulled up Twitter, they realized it was a catastrophe. The way he put it was, you had these people who've been longtime fans of the president threatening to commit ritual suicide. They suddenly realized that the coverage was going to be terrible. The next day coverage was going to be terrible. The social media coverage was going to be terrible. And so that's really when they got fully into Twitter and got really ramped up this operation where they try to put out the media brush fires before they get out of control. Now, the White House only responds on Twitter if it wants to escalate something. If a Republican operative is involved, for example, or if picking a public fight with a reporter might dissuade others from taking the same line, more often we get private phone calls or emails denouncing our tweets. I mean, it seems ridiculous on some level that these veteran communications staffers are reduced to calling us up to complain about 140 characters, maybe not even 140 characters, but that is the world that the White House press corps lives in now. Now, this has led some reporters, including me, to use Twitter as a way to get answers that I can't get through more traditional channels. You know, we talk about the White House news briefing, you know, the near daily event, and the value of it, despite people who will criticize it as just a ridiculous ceremonial event that doesn't really generate a lot of news. And there are reasons to be worried about the impact of the briefing. Being able to ask a public question is extremely important, because when you ask a question in public, if someone doesn't answer, that's just as important as if they do. And so a bunch of us will ask aggressive questions on Twitter, knowing that the media monitor will forward it up the chain, knowing that it will go to about 80 senior staffers. Again, Chief of Staff, White House Counsel, the National Security Advisor's Office. It's a great pipeline into the administration. But the point, though, is that this White House still cares very, very much about what we think, what we say, and what we report. The filter is actually alive and well. Now, the question, I guess, is whether you all should care what is happening to the filter, and I would argue that you do, because as you watch the White House generate all of this content, it becomes increasingly difficult for us to put the policies in context, to inform our fellow citizens about the value or potential value of policies. It's a little bit scary to watch every day. I don't think, as I've tried to make clear, I think there are a lot of reasons to be very skeptical of the new media, social media triumphalism. There are a lot of reasons to be very skeptical that this White House has finally found the way to sideline reporters. I don't think that's true. But, you know, you can always tell me what you think. I'll be on Twitter @OKnox. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas and Olivier. My name is William Stedding, Senior Fellow at the Center for Presidential History here at SMU. On each panel today, we will hear from 2 scholars and 2 practitioners. The scholars will have 20 minutes to present each of their papers, followed by 10 minutes of commentary by each practitioner. After this, the scholars will have an opportunity to respond to comments they have heard from the practitioners, and we will also entertain questions from the audience. Before I introduce the first panel, I also have the pleasure of announcing that we have a collaboration in the works to produce an edited volume of this conference with Texas A&M University Press. The working title of the book is The Presidency and the Press, New Realities in an Old Relationship. And A&M's senior editor, Jay Dew, is fighting his way south from icy Oklahoma, but he'll be here at some point today. I think it is also appropriate today to honor and remember the one journalist who embodied, as well as anyone ever has, the spirit of the challenge that lies in the transition from columns to characters, Mr. David Carr of the New York Times, who passed away last Thursday. As his colleague David Leonhardt eulogized Mr. Carr in his column on Friday, he pointed out that, quote, when you listen to David write or talk about journalism, you didn't think, how lucky they were back in the old days. Rather, you thought, how lucky we are. As we sort through the many issues facing the relationship between the presidency and the press today, I think we should remain mindful of these words. Now, panel number 1. Our first presenter is Dr. Rita Kirk, the director of the McGuire Center for Ethics and Public Responsibility, and Altshuler Distinguished Teaching Professor in the Division of Communication Studies here at SMU. The title of her paper is New Media, Interactivity, and Rapid Response in Presidential Communication, the Narcotizing Dysfunction Revisited. Rita has assured me she's not here to talk about my youth. Our second presenter is Dr. Roderick Hart, Dean of the Moody College of Communication and Shivers Chair in Communication, Professor of Government, and founding director of the Annette Strauss Institute for Civic Life at the University of Texas at Austin. His paper is titled Presidents, Press, and the Language They Own, a Reexamination and Extension. Our commentator is Mr. Robert Mong, editor, as I'm told, editor emeritus as of yesterday, of the Dallas Morning News. Mr. Orr, formerly of the LA Times, is not with us today as he is attending to his new venture, which is an online sports venture in Denver, Colorado. Professor Kirk, the podium is yours.
Well, it's an honor to be here, and it's a little frightening, I have to tell you, because one of the things that academics do is talk to other academics. So the very nature of being critiqued by people who actually work in the field that we're analyzing is a little bit daunting for those in the academy, but we're excited for the opportunity to discuss these issues with you today. Now, I wanted to start by talking about the fact that we have new words in our lexicon that have never been used before, and one of those is a term like IRL, meaning in real life. Because in fact, a lot of things that do happen in our social media are not real life. And we're going to be talking a little bit about what happens to people when they get absorbed in social media and whether or not they're actually being really good citizens. I start this paper by talking about the evolution of what I call disruptive technologies, and there's a lot of academic works that are done on disruptive technologies. And I want to start off by pointing out to you that in these analyses, they've talked about the effect of papyrus on oral cultures, that suddenly somebody who was used to orality now had written words, and how that changed everything about our societies. The printing press certainly changed the notion of how societies communicated with one another. And then, of course, in the 1940s and 50s, the advent of the visual and auditory media that radicalized a shift in communication in the United States and then suddenly around the world. So when we think about those disruptive technologies, I want to focus on the last major disruption which happened during World War II. So at this particular time, one of the things that happened was a radicalization of the radio. It became more portable with the invention of transistors. It became more nationalized with the advent of FM radio. Television became more affordable, and it suddenly became a fixture in our households. And in fact, we reorganized our daily schedule around when the evening news was going to be given. And it even arranged our living rooms, if you think about it, as now the television became the central feature of that space. It brought families together for both news and entertainment, and in one of the first things where we see that blending of news and entertainment, radio and television were those mediums that allowed both to happen simultaneously. Citizens now then had a common flow, bless your heart, thank you so much, a common flow of information. And that began to change the way that we saw our news media. Now, television and radio threatened newspapers, and I don't think we often think about the fact that the same struggles that we're going through today about new media were the same things that we were looking at in the 1940s and 50s. For example, the visual media solved the issues of illiteracy. So there were a broad swath of the population in that period of time who were illiterate, and now suddenly they had no barriers to access to news events. We also found that the visual and auditory media could get information to us faster, so the news was released quicker. It monetized that reach by selling advertisements, because that broad swath of access suddenly allowed people to sell their ads at a higher price. But it also had another effect. Auditory and visual media had to simplify the message in order for people to really understand it. And it increased the importance of the image, both of the reporter and of the people who were speaking. So we would hire people who had beautiful voices on radio, people that had positive images for television. Columbia University started to say, what's going on with this whole media revolution in the 1940s and early 50s? And they set up a research school to really look at the issues of new media. And among them were key researchers, Lazarsfeld and Merton. They surveyed the environment and they concluded, media surrounds us. Now that may seem weird in our day today to even consider that, but at the time that was really a new concept, that media was pervasive and it surrounds us. By 1948, for example, 70 million people in the United States went to movies each week, 46 million read newspapers, 34 million listened to radio 3 or more hours a day. And for this, they said that they were concerned that the image or the effect of all of this media is that it would have what he called a narcotizing dysfunction. That is, we have so much information that we don't know how to process that it paralyzes us. So what is the narcotizing dysfunction and why should we care? Well, the first thing that I think we should consider is the definition. The vast supply of communication may elicit only a superficial concern with the problems of society, and this superficiality often cloaks mass apathy. Exposure to this flood of information may serve to narcotize rather than to energize the average listener or reader. Does that sound a little bit familiar to you about how we feel today with new media? Activism, according to Lazarsfeld, not the passive consumption of information, was considered to be the key to promote democracy. And remember, coming out of World War I and World War II, we were particularly concerned with the democratic process. They concluded in their research report, in short, the public takes his secondary contact with the world of political reality, his reading and listening of things, as a vicarious performance. He comes to mistake knowing about problems of the day for doing something about them. It does sound a little bit like today. So this narcotizing dysfunction was able, though, to give rise to what Lazarsfeld and Merton talked about as the rise of the power of the Fourth Estate. Now, the notion of the Fourth Estate had been around for some time, but in this particular era, it became really important to think of what was the role of the press and how did it become powerful. And the first way is that one-way communication model where the government had the power of getting coverage from the news media gave too much power to the government. And the solution to that was a powerful rise of journalists. Journalists became then the arbiter of news, the bulldog protectorate of the public interest, and the ones who held the government in check. So this particular notion of professional journalism, the standardization, became the model that most of us lived with until the rise of the new media. I argue then that what is happening now is we have yet another disruptive shift in technology. And what we're looking at is how that is similar and or different to what's happened in the past. So in our new media life, it's new media and the need for speed. We absolutely have to have news, and we have to have it fast. The legacy media is in somewhat of a decline, and I think there's very little doubt that that's the case today. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 became obsolete within 6 months of its passage, and in part because they were concerned with issues of telephony, not data. So they had done nothing in the 1996 Act to actually deal with anything related to new media. And since 1996, newspaper readership has dropped from 50% to 39%. Contrasting that, the new media in 1996 was the brand new tool, the one that a lot of people said was going to be obsolete before it got started. By 2002, 2/3 of US adults had access to the internet, and by 2012, we had moved to an era, as we just heard a few minutes ago, where Twitter is the first blush of the news. Now, in this paper, I talk about the fact that there are some problems that are created because of the way that the new media works. And the first one is the challenge of localism. Local newspapers in particular are folding, and that means that there are fewer people guarding the interest of the public in local and state government. So our news is becoming more nationalized. We are more concerned with the big stories and not the things closer to home. It's easier, in fact, according to most of the research out there today, to learn about a crisis in Darfur than it is to learn about what's happening in your own backyard. And it makes local issues seem less relevant. I want to point out that the Dallas Morning News in 2005 spent over $30 million a year in news gathering in this local market. And that was more than all of the local television affiliates combined. So there was this desire to try to do it, but that's expensive. And it's hard to maintain that in this economic market. So the result is that we had more centralized control of the news. And this is something that Walter Lippmann would have had great problems with. Lippmann said, "The secret of a truly free press, then, is that it should consist of many newspapers, decentralized in their ownership and their management, and dependent for their support upon the communities where they are written, where they are edited, and where they are read." And instead, we have more nationalized control of the news media. There is certainly the challenge of economics. New media, you see, is often viewed as free media. We want our stories, but we want them for free. And there's a financial squeeze then on the mainstream media with fewer reporters and more what we call rip and read talent. That is, you just pull something off the AP and you have a bunch of people talk about it. But it's not news gathering, it's news discussion. And there's a blur that's getting increasingly more important between news and advertising. It's now called native advertising, and in fact, many of our analysts would argue that it's a Faustian pack. We could be a little concerned about that when we understand that 78% of current journalistic revenues comes from the sale of advertising. So it's literally what's driving the whole machine at this particular moment. And the measures of commerce are changing. It used to be that we would talk about reach and frequency, and now we're talking about things like consumption and stickiness and sharing and unique visitors and time spent. The key measures to all of these are the speed of delivery, who gets the information out, who gets it out first, and who gets to set those first impressions of the news. And it's changing our political strategy, as we've been hearing from our earlier speakers this morning. Voter engagement has changed because we now have retweets, comments, fans, likes. Sentiment analysis is changing, where we actually use user opinion to try to figure out the sway of the public opinion in the media. We talk about conversion of leads. How fast can we move somebody to adopt a particular position? That goes anywhere from how much money can we get people to donate online to how quickly can we get somebody out to the polls to vote. And the share of voice, which is the number of mentions or the repetition of the story that we want people to tell. So the economics of it has changed, but it has some profound effects on this challenge to authority. In part, because there is the barrier of time. And the barriers of time become really important to us. Local media have less control, less ability to actually get information to us in the fastest way possible. And in the paper, I go into this quite extensively, and for the sake of our time, I'm going to be quite brief on this. From the evening news to news all the time, it's similar to what happened with the Pony Express, believe it or not. Since we're at SMU, I thought I'd throw that Pony Express comment in there. He who is the first to get there is the first to win. And if you think about how quickly the Pony Express radicalized our delivery of mail across the United States and how it captured our imaginations, it also captures our imagination to be the first ones to find out about some story that happens from around the world. Today, we are so addicted to time that the internet users will only stay waiting for your website to load 3 seconds before they're off. And it's getting shorter each time that we go through another cycle. The consumer loyalty then is to speed, it is not to a news organization, and that issue of loyalty becomes quite important to us. But there's also barriers to participation. The legacy media as some have argued in their critique, strives for a hierarchy of professionals and amateurs. They control the access, or for a long time have controlled access to media events. And one of the things that we imagine will change very quickly is that right now access to political conventions is done the same way that you get access to the newsrooms in the houses of Congress. So the majority of your income has to come from your job. So if you're in new media, it's very difficult to say that you earn all of your income or the majority of your income from your Twitter site or your news feed or your web blog. So it's becoming difficult for those folks to get into the halls. But they are arguing now that that model needs to change and change radically, because many of the people on the web blogs have larger followings than those in the traditional media. The third issue for us to consider is the rejection of the homogeneity of the masses. We now have news aggregators where you can choose the stories that you want to have covered, and they will cover for us. And we have personal sites now that you can create, so you create your own newspaper. And finally, I would argue that there's a rejection of the homogeneity of the legacy media. And that's sites like Big Journalism and the Daily Caller, who they openly argue are trying to balance what's going on in the legacy media by giving new and different points of view from the legacy media. In 2015, the data that were just released, not one of the top 10 news sites online was controlled by the legacy media. Not one. They're all new journalistic sites. Now that's had some dramatic impact on the body politic. The first thing, the one that you've heard all the way through today, is that we've been able to bypass the traditional filters of news gatherers. Campaigns can circumvent the media just as easily as the White House can, and we heard about that this morning. And advocacy groups are getting equally adept at trying to get their messages out and to move voters and to push votes by targeting districts. Similarly, they found ways of stimulating conversation, and again, you heard that today through GIFs and tweets and Facebook posts. The social media landscapes now attract more visitors than the mainstream media. So the impact of all of this has been to have a decline of the silent majority and the rise of the engaged citizen. That happens in part because of data mining. So you may not be engaged because you're rising to express your voice, but you're engaged because we find out what you're interested in, where you are, and then we target messages to you. So in many ways, you can't be silent. If you're engaged in social media, if you have a social media presence at all, you can be found. It's also interesting to note that more people this year in the election decided to go onto websites to check the facts because they didn't believe what they were being told. They didn't believe it when the politicians said it, and they often don't believe it when the mainstream media says it. So those fact-checking sites are becoming increasingly important. And there is a preference for the viral tribe over PAC journalism. And that becomes a really interesting notion, because if you're the first to report the news, what do we listen to? Who are we wanting to hear from? So it's as if there's this echo chamber, and what we're looking for is anything that stands in opposition to that. And finally, individuals are becoming co-creators of the news. Now, increasingly, with all of this comes the importance of the collections of individuals and the decline of the masses, because individuals find other people of like mind and heart. The object of the new media is to find people where they are, where they're having conversations, and then to join them. To not have an aggressive social media strategy in 2015 is the equivalent of not having an aggressive TV strategy in the 1950s. We have to go where the conversations are happening, says Dan Pfeiffer, who's a senior advisor to the president. And easily we can document who is influential by tracking how many people those individual bloggers reach. So voter-to-voter contact has become a more powerful way to persuade voters than any 30-second ad has been. There was something in the 2008 election that affected how campaigns strategically made decisions and how the newsroom strategically made decisions on what to cover. PAC journalism then is essentially began to go viral, and that's Kevin Madden, the 2012 Romney advisor, speaking of the media. So in conclusion, I have argued that the narcotizing, the dysfunction then, helps to create a passive audience. The narcotizing dysfunction that we receive today is characterized similarly, but in a different way. I think we're still narcotized by a sense of overactivity. We're do too much all the time. A loss of criticality because all messages seem to be equal. There's nobody that's helping us to weight one idea over another. And quick, unconsidered choices. In fact, people tend to make decisions within an hour of getting the mediated message. So let me leave you with this one notion, and I hope you'll pay a little attention to this thought. Here's what behavior looks like today. There are more people in this world that own smartphones than own toothbrushes. 4 out of 5 consumers use their smartphones to shop. 52% of Americans use mobile for in-store research. 70% of mobile searches lead to online action within an hour. People that find you on mobile convert at almost 3 times the rate of those that find you on your desktop or your laptop. And those using mobile are out and about, living their lives, and ready to socially engage. Our media landscape has forever changed, and our challenge now is to find ways to make that work so that perhaps we can have a better sense of what good ideas are and how our democratic process might be impacted.
Thank you very much.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm bring you greetings from the People's Republic of Texas. As Governor Perry often thought of just how to describe Austin. I've been listening to Rita. It's interesting, her discussion about the way that new media have, and the previous speakers, the way that new media have overcome us. And in some ways, I'm going to present some research today, a study that essentially uses new media technologies to try to understand new media. I wonder where I should point.
The right-hand button.
Here is a memo, and it's it says, "Boss, we need to make our position clear on the following issues that are heating up in Congress. Do you want me to craft some rough drafts for you? Paid parental leave, ISIS in Syria, growing financial inequality, Keystone Pipeline." Signed, Randy. So my question is, do you think Randy is the chief assistant to the head speechwriter at the White House? Or do you believe that Randy is the chief assistant to the editorial page editor of the Washington Post? Presidential speechwriter. How many? There are only 2 choices. You got to make a decision. Washington Post? Okay. Well, you don't know what you're talking about. Because it could be either. And that's really the point, that politicians and reporters talk about the same stuff, and everybody knows that, and that's unsurprising. Traditional researchers have looked at I would think, two basic questions, and this generally captures the research. Does the president dominate the press? And so there's been a lot of studies of how the press has soft-pedaled some of the coverage of things like Abu Ghraib and Kosovo. A lot of very nice piece of research on how presidents are going local as well as national now, moving around the country to try to dominate local markets as well as national markets. The White House staff has increased dramatically over time, and almost all of those staffers have to do with somehow related to communication. As we heard earlier from Olivier, the online presidency has become very dominant. That's one large body of research. Another body of research is kind of much the opposite, and that is it's tough to be a president. The soundbite that the president gets has shrunk to almost nothing. The press is setting the president's agenda. News conferences have become more aggressive. If they're not commenting about reporting news, they're cynically deconstructing the presidency itself. So those are the two general kinds of research questions that have been asked. I'm going to ask some different questions today. And it stems from Randy's note. Since reporters and presidents talk about the same things, do they sound the same? There's one person thinks that they don't sound the same. Good. If they sound the same, why hasn't anyone noticed? If they don't sound the same, how do they sound? If they don't sound the same, what does it mean that they don't sound the same? In the biological sciences, this study that I'm going to report today would be called basic research. I'm trying to ask a question that is underneath a lot of the things that people want to know about these two great institutions, the press and the presidency, but I think have not really been asked at this level of depth. Nobody's really asked these particular kind of questions before. Instead, people have assumed politicians, reporters are different. They come from different solar systems, that their differences are natural, unsurprising, and unimportant. And as a result, I believe, because we haven't asked this particular kind of question before, what is the root nature of the presidency and the press? We've underestimated what I believe are the institutional determinacies that make democracy contestational, but ultimately virtuous. If we could understand that which lies beneath the presidency, beneath reporting, we'd understand a good deal more about the nation in which we live. The premises I operate upon are these. People have a lot of implicit knowledge about the political world. You can't call it to the front of the brain, but in the back there, we have these kind of implicit understandings. We use this knowledge to clarify things and to make decisions. We have a lot of implicit knowledge about a lot of things. How to drive a car, the best way to get from Dallas to Houston, what kind of person we should vote for president. But most of the time, our fundaments of our knowledge are not radically in the front of the brain. People don't know that they have this knowledge, but the knowledge, people's implicit knowledge leaks out. And I believe that by studying this leakage, we can learn how people know what they know. Most people know things, but if you ask people, how do you know what you know, almost everybody looks at you as if you were from another planet. But that makes it interesting for a researcher. So the questions I want to present to you this morning are these. What's special about presidential speech? What's special about political reporting? What happens when reporters and presidents interact? Have their interactions changed over time? And how might digital technologies change this relationship in the future? So this is a study that is an extension of work that I've done over the years. And without getting into too much detail, my assumption here is that the presidency is many, many things. But one of the things it is, it's also a text. That is, and you've heard that before, the amount of information that is being generated by the presidency, it is one of the largest text-producing, and always has been, machines in the world. And journalism is many things, many kinds of an institution, but it's also a text. It produces text. So that's my assumption. And so we have, over the years, collected a great number of political speeches, print news reports, broadcast news transcripts. We've looked in depth at 120 presidential press conferences, looked at other kinds of fiction and nonfiction, and I'll explain why in a minute. 273 specialized news reports, 225 online blogs. The method of study that I use will perhaps seem strange. Someone mentioned sentiment analysis before, and this is an example of that. This is a kind of a big data approach that chunks a lot of language through a machine that is called Diction. It's a piece of software that I created. I started doing it. It used to be called my dissertation many, many years ago. But ultimately, it became a tool that I have used and others have used to run over text to see what's there. It's really what my main concern is to try to understand political tone. And the assumptions that the program makes are these: that people compare everything we know by means of comparison. People compare what they hear to what they've already heard. And that's how we make discriminations. We're not consciously aware of making these comparisons, but we do it. We're not conscious of them. But you can't know one thing without knowing two things. Do you like Dallas? Well, compared to what? How about Houston? Oh, yeah. All right, so then you know you like Dallas because it's not Houston, if that's true. So diction compares all these messages to a normative database, and we've processed over 50,000 texts over the years. And having that kind of bulwark to compare things to is really very, very handy. Oh, sorry. This is what the program looks like without getting into a great deal of detail. It has a group of categories or what are called dictionaries, and they come in different colors and shapes and sizes. And basically what the program does is it goes and searches a text with all of these very different kinds of word lists. And it generates 5 general understandings of a text, and how certain the text is, how optimistic it is, how active versus passive, how realistic versus abstract, and whether or not it's group-centered or individually centered. And if you're interested, you can go online and find out more about the program. You actually try it out online and see what it looks like. So this is what a dictionary is. And this is a dictionary called Spatial Terms. And if you look at that and it doesn't remind you of space, then it's probably not a good program for you to use. And it has about 35 of these dictionaries in it that looks over these passages. Well, a lot of people say, turning words into numbers, aren't you embarrassed to be doing that? God made these wonderful words and you're just putting them in a machine and chomping them all up, and it's an insult to everything that's good and human and decent. And I appreciate that. In fact, John Barth said it even better. The great novelist said, "The computer could not act on a hunch or a brilliant impulse. It had no intuitions or exaltations. It could request but not yearn, indicate but not insinuate or exhort, command but not care. It had no sense of style or grasp of the ineffable. Its correlations were exact, but its metaphors wretched. It could play chess but not poker." Well, I think it's all terrific what he said, except for that last line. It could play chess but not poker. I'm interested in poker. I study politics. And so that's the great challenge. Can this technique help us understand political life better? So my defense to Mr. Barth is that what diction does is it assumes that tone is the product of individual word choices that cumulatively build up to produce in our minds, to produce patterned expectations that tell us something important about an author's relationship to the text. Which brings me to Sherlock Holmes. One of the things that Holmes once said to Watson, he said, you know, Watson, if you want to know everything you need to know about a man, you just look at his shoes. And Watson said, what do you mean? What do you mean, Holmes? Look at his shoes. He said, well, he says, nobody pays any attention to people's shoes. He says, but you look at a man's shoes, you can read into his soul. And he said, this is ridiculous. What are you talking about, Holmes? And he said, well, you see, you look at a man walk down the street. Does he have shine shoes? And if his shoes aren't shine, that tells you something. Well, he's not a man of good character, doesn't care as much about things. And he said, if you look how he wears, if it's worn down on the outside, if the heel is worn down on the outside, that's a man in a hurry, and you can tell where he's going to go. Everything you need to know about a man, Watson, is you look at his shoes. Well, in a way, if you look at people's words, because we don't pay attention to the words we use, we certainly don't pay conscious attention to them oftentimes. And so this is a program that kind of looks at words in the ways that Holmes looked at shoes. In this particular study, I use 3 things to test a measure of what I call insistence, and that is whether or not things tend to be repeated. Something I call the hortatory style, which basically is a measure of assured pronouncements about God, country, and citizenship. And the narrative force, rich descriptions of what people did at some particular time and place. without getting into a lot of detail, the formulas for these are here, and it's basically a question of standardizing these things and putting them together in ways to get a sense of the tone of a text. That's the basic story. Well, this is my story. That's the basic tool. So what did I find when I chunked all of this stuff in? Well, I found that reporters are in fact storytellers, but compared to music, lyrics, and TV drama, and novels, and short stories, and theater scripts, they're pretty modest storytellers. Now, compared to social science scholars and legal documents and annual reports from businesses and philosophical essays, they're really great storytellers. So why aren't reporters storytellers like Hemingway was a storyteller? It's because they have to make points. When young people were working for Bob Mung and they came to him with a beautifully written thing, and he would look at it and he would say, well, so what's the point here? Oh, I'm not making a point. I'm just telling you this wonderful story. He'd say, get out of my office. When you've got a point to make, come back to me. That's journalism. Now, if you went to Hemingway and said, well, what was your point here? Well, he'd throw one of his bottles of booze at you, and because he's not interested in making points, he's interested in telling a story. And so in some senses, you can see, in a way, this is what journalism is. It's somewhere between the worlds of story and, if you will, science. Somewhere in between. Something that no one had noticed before. Compared to fiction writers, journalists are more sober, if you'll forgive me. They tell more external things. They don't go inside the mind nearly as much as fiction writers. They interrupt their stories by making points, and that's why they're not in the Hemingway business. TV journalism, compared to print journalism, performs its stories. Print journalism explains them. So if you look at broadcast news, it looks different from print news, and one of the reasons that it's different is because of this business of becoming, in a sense, part of the story, which is what the broadcast journalist becomes, rightly or wrongly. Politicians, on the other hand, are very different from reporters. They are what I call evangelical, if you will. They use the hortatory style, and you can see compared politicians in the press here compared. Whereas what the key thing that one takes away from this particular study about reporters are they high on insistence. That is, they repeat the same thing again and again and again. They're not obvious, they're not conscious of it, but if you look carefully at the language, there's a good deal of repetition. That seems like a small thing, but in fact it becomes a really important thing. So this is the sound of politics, and you've heard it, and you've gone to sleep to it many times. In the face of tyranny, a band of patriots brought an empire to its knees. In the face of secession, we unified a nation, and blah, 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 blah. That sounds like politics. That's what the hortatory style looks like. God, country, and this is Barack Obama announcing his presidential campaign. When the New York Times covered the story of Barack Obama's announcement, it gave a couple of details, but it provided historical context. It got a couple of direct quotes, and then it started to talk to Walter Mondale and Gary Hart about the problems that guy was going to have running for office. He talked a lot about Hillary Clinton. Could the guy build a campaign staff? What's his anti-war position? Was he going to seem as patriotic? This is what the New York Times did to this wonderful story that Barack Obama was trying to tell us when he announced his campaign. They don't do the same things. They play a different game. Now, this was an interesting finding, and at first you're going to say, well, this is just totally crazy. But in fact, it may be crazy, but it in fact is true that politicians use the narrative style considerably more than the press. They tell stories more richly than does the press. How can that be true? And I know there are a lot of reporters here in the room saying this is a terrible thing to think that somehow politicians tell better stories. I'm not saying they're better stories. They tell more of them. So Barack goes to Michigan, and says, I'm going to close with a story of a guy named Ramon because we're rooting for guys like Ramon. Ramon spent 8 years in the military, served in Afghanistan, served in Iraq. But when Ramon came home, he had a hard time finding a job because it was a tough economy. He didn't want to bring a burden on his family, blah, blah, blah. And then ultimately, because of my actions as president, we got the motor car business back in business. That's storytelling too. In contrast, what journalists do is they constantly stay on track. Oh, please, thank you. They're high insistence scores. They constantly and relentlessly focus on particular things. They're called dogged in some ways. Journalists' key is don't let them change the subject. That's what reporters try to do at all times. And what do politicians try to do? They use what's called the pivot. That is, they start, you say, well, do you like blue paint? Well, thank you for asking that question. You know, we live in a world that is painted every day for us, which reminds me of the time that I went to do something else. It drives reporters crazy. But what essentially they're doing is they're escaping the insistence that the politician brings, that the reporter brings to it. Here are politicians and reporters on insistence scores. Politician campaign speech, when reporters cover their story, they're much more insistent. When they cover press conferences, the same thing. Basically, the brains of politicians and reporters are wired differently, and they say different things. Politicians are basically saying one thing to us, things like, always remember. And the journalist, on the other hand, is basically saying, don't forget. Those are very different kinds of stories. Those are very different kinds of admonishments. One takes us into the past for some particular purpose, and the reporter is saying, wait a minute, don't you let them get away from where we're trying to get them. Looked at press conferences over time, 1948 to 2012, and it has generated what I call the White House arabesque. Over time, reporters' insistence scores have gone down. What this means is that as the years have gone on, more and more people have gotten into the question-asking business in the White House press conference, and they have become much more spread out in the kinds of questions they've asked. Everybody wants a little piece of that moment, and so they ask increasingly different questions. So what does that mean for the president? It means that over time, because the press has become more and more disorderly over time because more are involved and there are so many more topics, it allows the president to do his number increasingly over time. I'm not saying these are direct cause and effect here because that would be a very difficult thing mathematically to prove, but it looks like a heck of a good correlational case that as reporters become less focused, presidents take them up on it and tell their story in the most elaborate way possible. New media, I had a little bit of data about what happens when I compare reporters to news bloggers. And one of the things that you can see from this is that their insistence scores are considerably lower on blogs. What does that mean? It means that there's much more there's much richer and more open story among bloggers, and I use some examples in the paper to suggest that what's happening, because there is an unlimited amount of space in cyberspace, bloggers use more of that space. They're much less insistent. And again, when people were reporting for the Dallas Morning News, Bob Mong made sure that they stayed on course. Bloggers, on the other hand, take another route. So, conclusion. I see a lot of students here, and college is terrific, and it was nice of you to come. And so what you've learned here today is that politicians are not reporters. College is terrific. You learn this kind of stuff in college. And I know half of you are just thinking, God, I'm glad I came here at 8 o'clock in the morning to learn that reporters and politicians are just different people. That's about half of you. The other half of you are saying, duh. So, in conclusion, how do you be a reporter? You don't get carried away with your storytelling. You wear them down with your persistence. You avoid the Brian Williams moment by trying not to become part of the story. And remember that the story is not about you. How do you be a president? You try to preside. You try to climb above the miasma of the moment, the details of the moment. You capture them with your stories. Make sure you have room to roam. You avoid as much of that insistent reporter as you possibly can. Remember, it's your press conference, and so you try to make sure that it goes in the directions you want it to go. So how to be a citizen? I think the tensions between presidents and reporters are important. One's a sermonizer, and one's relentless, and these tensions are built in, and that's what makes, I think, the democracy work, and we have to make sure that these tensions stay as tensions. On the other hand, we should worry about presidents. Are we asking too much of them? It's great that they can go out and dominate the world with Twitter, but that takes things off the table, and that's probably worrisome. We ought to worry about journalists, whether the medium, whether the new media will change the message. I think it's terribly important that that key concentrated focus of insistence that journalism has always had is maintained, but that's, I think, the temptations of the cyber age may make that increasingly rare. And I think we have to worry for ourselves. I'm deeply concerned about the political cynicism that reigns among us, and I don't know what we can do without these two grand institutions. We have to keep both of them alive and vital. And if we become, sometimes people say, well, what do you do? I said, I study media and politics. I study the two things that people hate the most. And everybody laughs at that. But I mean it ironically, because if it isn't for these two institutions, we are all in great deal of trouble indeed. Thank you.
Good morning. Let's put a little fire into the discussion. But first, since Dean Hart talked about the great John Barth, I use John Barth to kind of decide what kind of journalist do I look for. And this is drawn from a very famous John Barth novel. He said when he looked at people, he looked at a lot of folks who exhibited traits of heartfelt ineptitude. Well, I don't want reporters like that. You don't want employees like that. You don't want students like that. He also said he sees a lot of people who operate within the framework of a cool competence. That's okay. I'll take that. But what you really want, he said, is passionate virtuosity. And so I think the best of the media are made up by people like that. No serious journalist wants to be viewed as a two-dimensional figure in a 3D world. But that's how legacy journalists are often positioned in any discussion of digital transformation. Left behind, dismissed by engineering wizards and other digerati, on the wrong side of algorithmic warp speed, on the wrong side of history. Once a digital tsunami is done with a legacy journalist, the only thing left is a hank of hair. But is it really so? Who isn't vulnerable to this digital draft? Great universities? Read Ken Awatta's brilliant piece on Stanford. It's called Get Rich You. How does it end? With the foreboding, a tsunami is coming. And that's from President Hennessy. Is the President of the United States vulnerable? Ask Edward Snowden. The leader of the free world faces these fluid networks that are flourishing all over the world for good and evil. They don't respect sovereign borders. They can do things that only nation states and large institutions could do before. They are empowered by digital tools. The internet is a far more difficult place to control than the town square, says scholar and writer Taylor Owen. Is a formidable banker like Jamie Dimon vulnerable? Well, he's got digital competitors coming at him from every angle. Think Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency entrepreneurs who want to do for financial services what the internet did for content and e-commerce. In her paper, Dr. Kirk correctly states that the media representation at this conference today are on the cutting edge of reshaping legacy media to account for changes in the media environment. And that's no easy task. Yes, legacy journalists are fighting for survival. I represent the oldest continuously operated business in Texas, begun when Texas was a republic. It just doesn't get any more legacy than that in Texas. Disruption threatens our existence, but I think it also points the way out. We have been adapting and learning at a rapid pace for years, as have other serious legacy media organizations. Billionaires are getting drawn into the fold. Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, John Henry, they all bought important newspapers in key markets. Why? Because they see these fiercely focused newspapers serving indispensable information with a deep sense of community. And those are Buffett's words. That's why he did it. Meanwhile, here in Dallas, we have many advantages in this market. No debt, lots of cash on the balance sheet, the South's largest newsroom. We have reach, a readership that votes, and astonishing convening power. We have also forged a strategy that is both realistic and not entirely obvious. Of course, we aim to keep our core strong because that's still where a lot of the money is. But we're growing our digital media and associated revenue. We redirect a lot of the core revenue to create new products. That's called organic growth. And we're targeting acquisitions. That's what you can do when you don't have any debt and you have a lot of money on the balance sheet. Time will tell whether it works. But it's clear. An increasing portion of our revenue is derived from things that did not exist a few years ago. That's good. Our audience research is also clear, and I hope some of you find this reassuring. An important market exists here that wants substance and demands serious journalism. They will pay for enterprise, investigative, and watchdog content. With our strong balance sheet, we've made great strides in changing our DNA. Last year, we hired an epidemiologist to cover emerging diseases. A year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I added an architecture critic to ignite community conversations about growth. There's nobody else like him in this market. I found reporters who know stuff, someone with a PhD in genetics, others with strong grasp of statistics and data. We've added capacity from Google, Nokia, television, big data firms, even GameStop. Dr. Kirk correctly notes the balance of power has shifted from folks who buy ink by the barrel to those individuals armed with digital tools. One-way, top-down communication of events is now interactive and dynamic, and that's a better mousetrap. What's not to like? The media must come to you. An Arab Spring can be ginned up. You can use Yelp and find a waiting tap room a click away. You can hector your city council member about a pothole, and it's more likely you'll get an answer. These are very powerful tools indeed. At the same time, as journalists, we must address the price paid for such freedom, a loss of privacy. the potential for state-sponsored surveillance under real and imagined guises of public safety and national security. And in some places in the world where the Arab Spring promised so much, the state responded with savage force, secrecy, and stifling control. There is no panacea. Dr. Kirk writes that with the advent of new media, the scenario shifts from press control to a complex system that prefers mainstream media still, but is capable of circumventing it to reach previously untouched publics. Campaigns, she writes, have embraced the new media model and have discovered innovative uses in each campaign cycle. And that's true enough. But are these techniques taking hold? Texas demographics would suggest that by now the state should be turning purple. But it's not, clearly. Despite the ardent efforts using all sorts of media technologies, groups like Battleground Texas, the vote's not following. Maybe by 2022, maybe not. Nationally, the electorate is still behaving pretty traditionally and predictably, for the time being at least. Can we all agree that we have two sets of voters, as the National Journal's Ronald Brownstein says so well? One votes for presidents, and the other votes in midterms. Democratic changes may well overwhelm this trend eventually, but no amount of granular social media has disrupted this every two-year cycle yet. No questions. The campaigns use technologies to micro-target potential voters, raise money less expensively through social media, and respond almost immediately to political attacks. Dr. Kirk points out the decline of the silent majority and the rise of the engaged citizen. But has all this tech capacity made the country more democratic or its citizens more engaged? Do we yet have a cyber democracy? It's certainly happening in many areas of civic life. Tech tools, community engaged law enforcement are making policing more effective and responsive. Crime is down nearly everywhere. The best nonprofits know that most problems are analyzable, and they're using technology to reduce social ills. Teen pregnancies are down. Domestic violence is down. Testaments to the competencies that these nonprofits are putting into action. From the ground, I'm not seeing it work out in politics yet, despite all the frenetic activity. With all the apps, clickable polls, campaign videos, social media intimacy, most citizens still seem to be abstaining from the political process except in presidential elections. Dr. Kirk notes that poll-obsessed politicians are finding opinion polling more difficult methodologically with the rise of caller ID, cell phones, and other things. True enough. But high-quality pollsters like Pew, they certainly acknowledge that area codes have virtually no meaning anymore. But a slew of savvy researchers are adapting. Pew chief Michael Dimmock has his organization increasing mobile phone interviews and other techniques enabled by technology. Changes are time-consuming, costly, and a challenge to get right, he told the National Journal recently. They're even making huge strides in international polling. You'll remember their great poll about the decline in Catholicism in Latin America last year. But what Pew is doing is a great proxy for legacy media. Adapt to stay relevant and to differentiate, or else. When it comes to political coverage, most of us live in a genuine codependency environment with our media competitors, professional and amateur bloggers, activists, campaign staffs, donors, and the candidates themselves. At our place, in this region, we try to stay ahead of the curve. For instance, received a vague tip, totally unfounded, about a candidate's resume, as we did in last year's gubernatorial campaign. This is where having a strong, highly skilled staff pays off. We research it, discover the truth, and once vet it, we put it online, post to Facebook and Twitter, and eventually publish it in the newspaper. In real time then, both campaigns, along with the blogosphere and competing media, react in a furious, fast pace. We are attacked, praised, copied, excoriated, challenged, and eventually vindicated. So you see, political journalism remains, and I think this is important, a blending of old and new techniques, and absorbed on many platforms by an increasingly fragmented and polarized America. In his impressively researched and nicely written paper entitled "The Press and the Presidency in Contrast, a Language Analysis," Dean Ron Hart, you'll have to read this later, has some fun with my modest college athletic career. But Dean, I'll tell you something else I learned at Haverford College that has stood the test of time, at least for me. With all that modernity brings, there are enduring qualities we would be wise not to ignore. Human nature doesn't change over time, though the human condition is definitely revved up these days and over-caffeinated. And brilliant observers, now long dead, can tell us much about the modern world as we cover it. Nearly 130 years ago, Lord James Bryce published one of the most penetrating and enduring analyses of our political nature, the American Commonwealth. Since we are discussing the press and the presidency today, you will recall what Bryce had to say. Great men are rarely elected president. For every Washington, Jefferson, or Lincoln, there are far more Franklin Pierces, Millard Fillmores, James Buchanans, and can we forget Chester Arthur? The sifting and winnowing of our presidential process has a way of removing the sharp edge of genius. Agree or disagree, the point is that history can be a powerful guide for journalists, which is why modern journalists are doomed if they merely practice the techniques of journalism, no matter how digitally skilled they are. They need advanced critical thinking capabilities and the wisdom of perspective. As Vartan Gregorian said so well, journalists should be cultured people who know about history, economics, and science. As Dean Hart's ample research shows, most reporters do not sound like Saul Bellow. Yet journalists can learn from artists. Has any journalist portrayed Pittsburgh, say, as well as Annie Dillard, August Wilson, or John Edgar Wideman? Natives all. Few journalists have written as eloquently on the essence of politics as Robert Penn Warren in All the King's Men. My hope is, Dean Hart states, that this project will tell us more about the distinctive sound of American politics, the demands imposed on journalism in an age of disruption, and what happens when reporters and presidents come face to face. These disruptions strain journalism to the hilt. But you know what? They also squeeze presidents and legislators and policymakers and jurists. Conventional centers of power, whether in the press or in government, face staggering challenges of keeping up with the increasingly consolidated private power of technological titans, Think GAF, Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, powerful monopolies all. In so many ways, their smooth, frictionless products make our lives so much better, so much easier. Yet First Amendment scholar Tim Wu says, on a daily basis as we speak, internet companies are making speech-related decisions more important than those made by any government. The American Constitution was written to control abuses of power, but it didn't account for the heavy concentration of private power that we see today. And in the end, power is power, whether in private or public hands. I guess what I'm saying is that there are no easy assumptions around our topic today. The old and new blend in powerful, untidy ways. Dean Hart concludes, journalism now confronts both technological and economic challenges. It would put its house in order if it knew where its house was located. How about I give the good Dean the last word? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, personally, I'm outraged at the savage attack.
Any questions from the floor? Ma'am? Wait for the microphone just a moment, I'm sorry.
So I was just interested in the talk that we heard about, how journalists are different from politicians. It struck me that politicians usually are talking. And so, so the question really becomes one of, are we surprised that politicians use more stories? Because after all, it's not a written medium. It's not something you can go back to. It's sort of when they're talking, stories typically are much more memorable, and therefore people, sort of in oral cultures, they rely a lot on storytelling. So I'm wondering to what extent the effects that you see in your data are actually caused by the fact that these are speeches that are now written and analyzed versus, journalists who are writing. And that sort of the structure of the text and the rhetorical techniques that people use are very much informed by the medium in which the information is communicated in the first place. So that was just a question.
No, I think that's thoughtful, and certainly they're in the speaking business, and I guess it's sort of a research question of whether or not oral narrative and written narratives are of a different sort. My guess is that most of the stuff that sounds oral has been written for the president to sound oral. He doesn't do stories off the cuff. He does it from a text. So I think in some ways it's sort of a toss-up question, but thoughtful.
Sir, right here. Microphone coming behind you. There you go.
Yeah, this is great so far. Thanks a lot. And disruptions are really interesting to me, and things Dr. Kirk was talking about, the new disruptions in the media and everything. And the question I had was how many people, what percentage are using social media? And then she did say there's more social media than traditional or mainstream. But I guess my question is, anyone looked at, who's using both? Are the social medias, is that all they hear? Are they people also, doing some of both? As you said, I think, we need to do some of both. And I just wonder if anybody's looked at sort of percent that gets their news from both places.
Well, they have, and Robert Mong may actually have some data from the Dallas Morning News that he could share about that, but even the print media is using their digital version more and more. Wall Street Journal is often delivered through your iPad rather than the physical copy. It's hard to find a newspaper stand anymore just to go get a newspaper unless you're in a hotel. But perhaps you could share some of your data.
Now, people who care about news, they get it from all sorts of platforms, and our core readers, that's exactly what they do. We're one of many choices that they use. As far as the reach that you have, we have 9 million unique visitors a month, a good month. and far fewer than that read the paper. So it's obviously a very important outreach for us.
Question back here, ma'am.
I just wanted to get your thoughts about, we didn't talk about the press room at the Russell Senate office building or the press room at the Longworth House building. And we have the technology to connect voters with the 535 representatives and to get a more instant reaction from our elected officials and have journalism play a role in analyzing what that instant reaction might be and how Congress might vote and interact with the president. But and then sift through that and see whether Citizens United is playing more of a role than it should, issues like that. Dr. Hart, I'd like your thoughts on, what could be done electronically to connect, maybe real registered voters with their elected officials, and then how journalism might be able to sift through some kind of contemporaneous responses that you might get from polling the population, tying that to people that can actually vote, and then causing their elected officials to take action maybe quicker than they'd actually vote in Congress so we could develop opinions on a real-time basis. Thanks.
I'll try to make a quick response and pass over to Rita because I think it connects really to something she said. What we all want today are aggregators. We want someone to go and pull all this stuff together for us and distill it because there's so much out there. In another world, that would have been called journalism. And that's really the essence of good part of journalism. There's stuff going on all the time, all over the world, all over our lives. Won't someone please sift it all down and give me the bottom line? That's called modernity. That's modern life. That's the life we live today. And I think it relates to exactly what Rita was talking about when in saying we're all overwhelmed. And so who will be our aggregators?
Mm-hmm. And I think you're exactly right. In the aggregation that we do now online, we just hit topics and it aggregates things for us automatically without any discrimination as to the quality of the source or the quality of the reporter. I think that's a marvelous new role for journalism, and I think journalists just don't know exactly how to get in that game to become the aggregator or the differentiator. But I think that's certainly an area that journalism needs to run. There's just too much information, and it comes at us too quickly, and there's no way really to put it in context. So hiring the experts, when the Ebola crisis hit here in Dallas, it was so important to have somebody who actually understood epidemiology and what was going on, and that kind of expertise, that deep expertise is what we, I think, long for, and we need more of.
One last question, ma'am.
My question is for Mr. Mong. How many online subscribers to the Dallas Morning News do we have?
Well, we have, as I said, on a good month, we have 9 million people who uniquely visit our site and for something, and we know where they come, generally where they come from, and what they read. It's a tremendous tool, and I think the reason we've hired a lot more folks in data analytics is to find out more about what people want. We can use other means to find out what are the important issues facing the community. And try to meld the two of those things together. But our online readership is far greater than our newspaper readership, the printed paper readership.
And let's thank our first panel, and we'll take a short break and reconvene at 10:30. All right, we're going to try and stay on schedule, so we're going to go ahead and get ready for panel 2. Our first presenter on this second panel is Dr. Stephen Smith, professor in the Department of Communication at the J. William Fulbright College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Arkansas. The title of his paper is Technological Transformations and Timeless Truths. Our second presenter is SMU's own Tony Peterson, professor and the Belo Foundation Endowed Distinguished Chair in Journalism. The title of his paper is Ellsberg to Snowden, Is It Journalism or Treason? Our commentators for this panel are Stacia Deshishku, Washington, D.C. Deputy Bureau Chief of ABC News, and Todd Gilman, Washington Bureau Chief for the Dallas Morning News. Stephen, the podium is yours.
Thank you. It's certainly an honor to be on the program with outstanding scholars and practitioners of the craft. And it's a topic that I find both interesting and amusing. The original title for my paper was Tweets and Twits. But we're not the first generation to wonder at how rapidly things are changing or to be surprised at how it's changing our lives. And the historical perspective that I began the paper with looks at the means of presidential communication during the War of 1812, in which it took 3 weeks for a transatlantic message to arrive from Ghent to the White House, and the war continued for several weeks after the treaty had been signed. But it becomes that my argument that Abraham Lincoln was the first wired president, the first to use the telegraph, long before BlackBerry 1 hit the campaign trail in 2008. The first telegraph machine was in the White House in 1866, the first telephone in 1877, but it wasn't until 1929 that the president actually had a telephone on his desk. The means of electronic communication with the public expanded, of course, with radio when Calvin Coolidge delivered his State of the Union address to a joint session in 1923. And his inaugural address in 25 had 25 stations and a potential audience at 23 million. In 33, Franklin Roosevelt begins his fireside chats with 800 stations and an estimated audience of 40 million. So this is the first time that citizens have actually heard their president. They've seen photographs or they've read docs. The first time they've actually heard their voice. The first televised presidential address came in 1947 with Harry Truman. Ronald Reagan started the Saturday radio broadcast every week. So there have been changes throughout all of this time. But the information age becomes, I think, worthy of increased attention with Clinton in the White House. And he reflected on his years in office that at the time that he took office, there were about 50 websites available. The average cell phone weighed about 5 pounds. So the changes that have happened since that time. The first website comes up when less than 10% of Americans would even be able to access it and see it on their dial-up modem. And there was no access to government documents or other information online in 1992. Clinton was not particularly adept as an online communicator. He sent a total of 2 emails during the time that he was president. And I assure you that's, that's accurate. There were only 4 million hits or visits to the White House webpage during its first year in operation. But by the time he left office, the number of computers that were actually personal computers connected to the internet had grown from 1.3 million to more than 56 million, and the growth of websites from 130 to 3.6 million. So the things that we take for granted now were not there. In a former life, I worked on the staff of the president. Well, he wasn't the president then, but it was before there was email. It was before there were websites, and there were stacks of these haunting pink slips that said, "While you were out, someone called." But at least there was time to stop and reflect before you had to return a message on that time. Compared with President Clinton, President Bush was an email impresario, regretted that he couldn't spend as much time online after he became president. But even with the Bush White House, Twitter didn't become available until 2007, and there was one instance where they were approached by Facebook and wanted President Bush to have a Facebook page in which his press secretary couldn't understand why they would bother with that, because they were getting 7 million page views a week on the White House webpage and didn't see that Facebook would be anything nearly as effective for reaching the public. The social media president, of course, was President Obama, who began from his campaign bringing in Facebook, MySpace, a web page, 1,800 videos, and 2 days after the election started change.gov and moved into Obama 2.0, they call the operation at the White House. And I think there was already recognition at that time among the press that this was going to be somewhat troublesome, because they didn't know exactly how this was going to be used, how it would change the relationship. And rightly so, I think. When their new media director is 30 years old, which is probably above the average age of most of the people, and you find out there's a White House Office for Digital Strategy, a new one on the organizational chart. But still, the old type of communication continues, even though the new media is there. The White House gets about 100,000 emails a day, 1,000 faxes, 2,500 to 3,500 phone calls, as well as 65,000 regular written letters each week. But all of the information, as you heard earlier, things that were dropped into the bin are now just sent out immediately on some form of social media. The argument of the White House is that this increases civic engagement, and they're able to involve a new audience and a larger number of people through the use of this, and certainly they do. They have a White House blog, a MySpace page, Twitter, Facebook, a YouTube channel, Google Plus Fireside Hangout, Scribe, Flickr, SlideShare, LinkedIn, Foursquare, Instagram, and GetItTub. So those links are all available on the White House website, as well as the official White House mobile app. Fan page ranks the president #1 internationally among politicians, based on his 44.8 million Facebook fans and 53.97 million Twitter followers. In addition, the White House Facebook has over 3 million likes and a primary Twitter account with 5.78 million followers. So the information going out and much of that is news, that 64% of adults use Facebook for news, and 30% of the American people overall claim Facebook as a main source of news. So with Obama's Twitter account, among all Twitter accounts, ranks number 3 internationally. Compare that with the New York Times, which ranks number 51. So at least the number of people reached, whether or not those are positive or negative responses or receptions, remains to be seen. But I think the 2015 State of the Union speech is an exemplar of what's happening with this administration. It was a massive media production, unlike anything ever seen, and it's not clear exactly why. They began about 3 weeks before the address with what were called State of the Union spoiler alerts. They began laying out the main points with visits to different parts of the country. And they did so in a time when a lot of people were questioning whether or not the State of the Union was really a relevant communication institution any longer. It's of course required by the Constitution, but it can be sent as a written document, or perhaps, as one person suggested, just send Congress an email outlining what you wish to do on that. So the selling of the State of the Union, I think, provides a lot of insight into how they did this and how things have changed. And it was not an easy audience. There were numerous audiences that have been mentioned before, but there were also numerous problems. He was facing a hostile Congress. He was talking to a public that less frequently watched on television these things. So how do you come over those points of resistance and reinvent and redefine civic engagement in the media age, which they did with these spoilers? They got 8.3 million views on the advanced Facebook rollout of the issues. For the first time, they lifted their own embargo on the text and published it online. That immediately had 400,000 viewers of the text that's usually kept sort of in-house until 20 minutes before. They created Twitter hashtags in advance and posted them online so everyone would know when to say what and reach their largest audience. There were 2.6 million tweets about the state of the hashtag SOTU, and Nielsen rated it with an audience of 9.724 million, 295 million impressions, 681,000 authors, and 2.598 million tweets. So you have a large stream of conversation going on, but for what effect? Is this going to shore up the president's position for the next election? No, as he reminded you, he was not running again. Is it going to persuade the Republican majority in both houses to adopt those? Unlikely. Is he building a Democratic Party base for the future? If so, probably only inadvertently. But it's obvious that those who are within the White House office enamored with these new technologies are using them beyond imagination. And the follow-up with the state of speech, where he had interviews with 3 vloggers, people who had YouTube channels to ask questions rather than and this was something I think that reflects some of the angst among the press, that these aren't professional journalists asking these questions. You're going to get softballs. It's beneath the dignity of the office said Fox News. But he was able to reach a much larger audience. Keep in mind that the combined primetime cable audience for Fox News, CNN, and the MSNBC in 2014 averaged 2.85 million viewers. The White House YouTube channel with this interview has been viewed 3 million times, and the three vloggers themselves have a total of 14 million followers. So it's certainly a new way to reach a new audience, but still the effect, I think, is questionable. But what is not questionable, I think, is how this is part of an effort to bypass the legacy media or any media to act as a filter. And it's certainly not new. Presidents have always done that. It is a contest over who gets to tell the story. And the president has been working overtime with the new media to do that. And the White House press corps feel that they have been both impaired in their ability to tell the story and most especially to ask questions. Taking the message to the public directly is not new, of course. Andrew Johnson tried it in 1866. Woodrow Wilson tried it in 1919. Franklin Roosevelt tried it in 1933. But what the presidents have done more cleverly, I think, in recent years, have been going to alternative forms. Bill Clinton was sort of the one that broke and mastered the art of the talk show. And even joked that he was able to stiff the White House press corps because Larry King would send him to the people directly. Obama made a similar remark. He said that he'd heard complaints that the press corps felt they'd been stiffed on being able to ask questions, and he said he owed them an apology, and they could check in on the White House YouTube channel to hear it. But Obama's also used the talk shows for effective policy work, going on Between Two Ferns, or going on Stephen Colbert, to market the Affordable Care Act. And it was on the Colbert report that he remarked, or the screen graphic when he was talking about how do you stop young people from signing up for Obamacare, and the screen graphic says, send request via LinkedIn. The main complaint, I think, is that the president is not making himself available directly to the news media for questioning. And some of those complaints, I mean, there are a number of serious complaints, I think, about the transparency of the federal government. And those are outlined in the 2013 special report for the Committee to Protect Journalists. Some of the other complaints are sort of minor whining, I think. Complaining that the president called on a blogger during a press conference. Complaining that they weren't able to take a picture of him playing golf with Tiger Woods while someone from Golf Digest and Golf World was able to tweet the golf game. And the response has been fairly strong. Critics calling it the reality show president, charged with implementing an Orwellian image control, labeling him the puppet master, all of which fit a certain story. And the complaint on the other side is equally hyperbolic, suggesting that reporters are just a bunch of whiners and deserve to be bypassed. But there are serious questions about the relationship between the president and the press, and that is, what is the appropriate role? Is it necessary to have this? And arguments are made, I think, by the press. Some are part of their ability to tell the story, and some are part of a legitimate questioning on that. There are a number of things, I've just been given a time signal, that I want to touch on that beyond this that I think change the nature of communication in the digital age. One is the expectation of immediacy. When you get a text message or even an email, the expectation on the other end is that you will see it immediately and respond to it immediately. And part of that is if you don't, if there's a delay in the response, then there are certain assumptions made is that you're being arrogant or you're dodging the question or whatever. The other thing is there's no time to think, as Bob Dylan sang. If you're always answering and responding to questions, there's no time to be creative or develop empathy and give a thoughtful response. The other is, what about feedback to all of this information that's going out? If it's all one way, well, it's not all one way. If you look at some of the comments on the White House YouTube channel, you'll see there are differing views about the information that's on there. And then there's organized trolling. There are handbooks and strategies for how to disrupt discussions, hijack the thread, bring up new questions and issues, and redirect the story. There's also research questions. I think that is, how's all this going to be archived? I mean, for one thing, from a historian and researcher, is it's better than trying to follow up on phone calls. But what about Facebook? How's this archived? And how are these messages received? How do you know? Well, Facebook's all-time running experiments, get out the vote experiments, empathy experiments. They can change their rules at any time, and whether or not those are, since they are in a private vendor, they're not covered by the Presidential Records Act. Or Snapchat, which disappears. Twitter's a rare case because they have deposited all of the tweets with the Library of Congress, but trying to go through those would take quite some time. So you have the research considerations is, how is this conversation going to be archived for the future? Finally, I think it is incumbent upon us as educators to do more in terms of media literacy, teaching the skills for people to be both senders and receivers of social media, and do so wisely. Few, if any, public schools are teaching the creation of social media, although I think they have a willing audience and one who would do much better. By the time they get to college, they already know this stuff. They know how to produce it, but do they do so? If we're still teaching traditional public speaking, should we be teaching how to blog and how to tweet effectively? So those are some questions that I'll pursue further in the article. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I can't resist just one old school story, and that is I graduated as an undergraduate in 1973, and I promptly went to work for the Houston Chronicle. And back in those days, when you went to work as a reporter, there was what was called a conversation, and the conversation was with the city editor. And the city editor would call you into his cubicle around 10 o'clock in the morning after the first afternoon deadline, and the conversation would involve the city editor pulling out of his desk drawer 2 paper cups and a bottle of bourbon. And the conversation went on from there. And that, male or female, that was the conversation that was held with the city editor. I can't imagine what would happen if anybody tried that today, but it would not be good. But it was old school. Since the terrorist attacks on the United States in 2001, the landscape of journalism, news media, and the reporting on government activities has changed dramatically. The concept of a press, the press as a check on government has existed since the founding, and to my mind, that function is very much in danger today. The USA Patriot Act, passed less than 2 months after the 2001 attacks, gave the government expanded authority for surveillance and intelligence gathering, and also limited information that had once been available to both the news media and the public. There were clear concerns raised by journalists and news media groups that the act would unreasonably limit news reporting. In just the last 5 years, 2 major disclosures of classified information have further complicated this issue. In 2010, Julian Assange, an Australian journalist and founder of WikiLeaks, disclosed thousands of military and diplomatic documents on the WikiLeaks website, and by working with selected news media organizations, among them the New York Times. In 2013, a former CIA employee and National Security Administration contractor named Edward Snowden leaked information about NSA activities and details about the agency's monitoring of public and private individuals worldwide. Both Assange and Snowden raised comparisons with Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst who in 1971 leaked the Pentagon Papers, a military, political, and diplomatic history of the Vietnam War. The 7,000 pages of documents, pages, by the way, pages, hard copy, paper, 7,000 pages of documents disclosed, among other things, quite embarrassing decisions and questionable decisions by the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations. Ellsberg was charged under the Espionage Act, but in 1973, charges were dismissed in large part because of the disclosure of criminal activities that had been authorized by the White House. The same claims regarding national security have been made today against Assange and Snowden, as well as traditional journalists such as James Risen of the New York Times. Risen has reported extensively on the NSA's monitoring of communications of private individuals as well as CIA activities. Opinions vary greatly on whether the actions of these individuals amount to whistleblowing where the government is held accountable for its actions, or whether they are traitors and disclosing information that puts the United States at risk. In addition, the questions of reporter privilege are more complex than ever. Reporter privilege, simply defined, is the right of journalists to use and maintain confidential sources for sensitive information. Especially in the case of Julian Assange, the question of who is a journalist has emerged as a vexing part of this traitor or hero issue. In 2010, WikiLeaks began receiving a series of classified documents from U.S. Army Private Bradley Manning. Assange began working with the New York Times, the Guardian of London, and the German magazine Der Spiegel. The organizations participated in the release of classified military and diplomatic cables involving the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. While some have tried to make favorable comparisons between what Assange did with WikiLeaks and that of traditional journalism, there are obvious contrasts. Journalism historically has involved the gathering of information and the writing and editing of news that is relevant to the public. While the news organizations publishing accounts based on the WikiLeaks documents said they were careful not to disclose information that might put people in danger, including names and identities of government informants, it was easy for enemies of the United States, including the Taliban, to search directly on the WikiLeaks website for such details. Floyd Abrams, the noted First Amendment lawyer who represented the New York Times in the Pentagon Papers case, has been quick to draw the distinction between Assange and Ellsberg. Ellsberg kept secret 4 volumes of the Pentagon Papers that dealt with diplomatic efforts to resolve the war. Abrams has noted that it was these 4 volumes that were the ones that were most sensitive to the United States government, and they were not made public until years later. When asked why he didn't disclose these 4 volumes, Ellsberg simply said he wanted to stop the killing, not the diplomacy. One of the most controversial parts of the WikiLeaks disclosures was a video showing an Apache helicopter attack on more than a dozen people walking on a Baghdad street. The video was shot from a helicopter camera on July 12, 2007, and released by WikiLeaks with the title Collateral Murder. 2 Reuters news employees were among those killed in the attack. Reuters had for 3 years unsuccessfully sought the video under the Freedom of Information Act. An 18-minute version of the video is available on YouTube and now has about 15 million views. The full unedited version is about 40 minutes and it's available on the WikiLeaks website. Just to give you a sample, I've taken the 18-minute video, and I've edited it to about 2 minutes that I want to show you. And I give you some warning, this is not necessarily easy to look at. The subtitles have been added by WikiLeaks, as well as the title, Collateral Murder. This came to the WikiLeaks website in a heavily encrypted fashion, and Julian Assange himself decrypted it and said it was moderately difficult to do so. The Department of Defense has said that the rules of engagement were followed in this attack, and no military personnel were disciplined. In 2002, the Swedish government sought extradition of Assange based on sexual complaints by 2 women. In London at the time, Assange sought refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy and is there to this day. He's been granted citizenship by the Ecuadorian government. Edward Snowden fits just about anyone's definition of a computer geek. Without a college degree, he ended up with access to classified information, raising serious questions about the number of people who had access to information and how they were chosen. As a contract worker for the NSA, Snowden was sent to Hawaii and given responsibility for copying millions of classified files from NSA computers on the mainland onto backup servers in Hawaii. Both Assange and Snowden appear by most accounts as somewhat eccentric, alienated, a bit naive, and perhaps even self-absorbed. Both, for varying reasons, became disillusioned and even angry at what they perceived as the overreach of government in intelligence and military activities. After fleeing to Hong Kong to provide the NSA information to journalists and the first reports had been published, Snowden, at the time 29 years old, identified himself in a video that was made public on the Guardian website. Very soon, his U.S. passport was revoked, and he was charged with violation of the Espionage Act. He met with Russian representatives in Hong Kong, flew to Moscow, where he remained in an airport transit zone for 39 days. In August of 2013, he was granted a 1-year visa, which was renewed the next year, and it is now considered likely that he will gain permanent citizenship in Russia. Snowden's disclosures are by far the most extensive in history that detail the U.S. government's technological reach in gathering intelligence. Among the most embarrassing revelations were the monitoring of phone conversations by world leaders, among them German Chancellor Angela Merkel. If one could imagine a complete opposite of both Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, it would be, personally and professionally, James Risen, since 1998 a reporter for the New York Times. He is old school in every regard, right down to his gumshoe reporting on national intelligence. The Pulitzer Prize winner was the first to report in 2005 on extensive monitoring of U.S. citizens without court approval. Risen became the symbol of a protracted struggle between the government and the media in 2006 with publication of his book, State of War, The Secret History of the CIA and the Bush Administration. Risen reported on the CIA's bungled attempt to thwart Iraq's nuclear program and said that, in fact, what probably happened was that the Iranian government was aided in development of nuclear technology. The Justice Department under President George W. Bush subpoenaed Risen to disclose his source and also named former CIA agent Jeffrey Sterling as a possible source on the Iran story. The original subpoena on Rosen expired in 2009, and the Justice Department under President Obama renewed it. James Risen steadfastly refused to disclose sources, saying that he would go to jail if he were held in contempt. Risen also called the Obama administration, quote, the greatest enemy to press freedom in a generation, end quote. Risen perhaps was also thinking of other aggressions the Justice Department committed against journalism, as well as the fact that the Obama administration has prosecuted 8 leakers, more than all previous administrations combined. In 2013, reports surfaced that the Justice Department seized 2 months of telephone records of the Associated Press in a leak investigation, an unprecedented monitoring of a U.S. news organization. Just a week afterward, there were reports about the disclosure that the FBI had named James Rosen, the chief Washington correspondent for Fox News, as a co-conspirator in a criminal investigation of another leak. The affidavit filed in federal court made it clear that Mr. Rosen's comings and goings at the State Department were monitored. In 2014, the Justice Department began to back off its aggressive behavior toward journalists. It is speculation as to the reasons. Maybe it was some embarrassment in not knowing, understanding, or respecting federal guidelines regarding subpoenas of journalists that had been in place since the 1970s. Perhaps it was just reaction and surprise at the unanimity and the vigor of criticism expressed by virtually all news organizations, ranging from Fox News to the New York Times. Before Obama was elected in 2008, a major security-related conflict involving the government and media ended up with Judith Miller, a reporter for the New York Times, jailed for 85 days for refusing to disclose the source of her information regarding the identity of Valerie Plame, a CIA operative and expert on the weapons of mass destruction. Reporters generally have long believed there's a compelling need to keep confidential certain sources of information, and many believe there is a legal right to do so. Currently, a majority of the states and the District of Columbia have specific statutes that establish at least some degree of protection for journalists. These laws are typically called shield laws, and they vary greatly from state to state. More than 70 news organizations, among them the New York Times and the Washington Post, have backed a federal shield law. In recent years, there has been an effort in Congress to pass a federal shield law, so far without success. The Supreme Court's decision in Brandsburg versus Hayes was a watershed event in United States journalism. In a 5-4 decision, the court decided that there was not a specific constitutional protection for journalists to keep from testifying. But the decision was sharply divided, and there were other skirmishes over the reporter privilege that came out of the Brandsburg decision, but there was also some general agreement about the need to strike a balance. There were guidelines drafted by the Department of Justice, and they were drafted under the Justice Department of John Mitchell in the next Nixon administration. In the 1970s, these guidelines became part of the Code of Federal Regulation. Many factors can be cited in the increased tension involving government and news media. We have the 24-hour news cycle, the ubiquitous nature of cable news, and of course the issue of national security. There is technology and the internet itself, called by Snowden the most important invention in all of human history. But the issue of reporter privilege and the ability to keep sensitive sources of information on a confidential basis can be separated from the legal concept of what has happened with Assange, WikiLeaks, and Snowden. And yet the disclosures by Assange and Snowden have clearly had a negative effect on the public perception of reporter privilege. We've witnessed this by many editorials and by what now seems to be a very small chance of any federal shield law passing the Congress. There are vexing questions that remain for the United States, for journalism, and for democracy. Are leakers entitled to whistleblower protections? Are journalists who work with leakers entitled to any protections? And how do we measure, in the long term, what citizens need to know about what their government is doing? Hasn't history told us that government can indeed hide and cover up things that we genuinely need to know about what is going on in our democracy? Isn't that, in fact, what being a check on government is all about? How reporter privilege continues to be recognized, whether in the courts or in the form of a shield law, will determine to some extent if and how the media will continue to be able to perform its role as a check on government. Thank you very much.
That down a little bit, I'm a little shorter. So thank you very much for inviting me. And we just heard two very different presentations, yet in my mind there was one common theme, and that is the Obama administration's dogged determination to manage their message by icing out the traditional media. This is being done in a number of ways. Completely circumventing the White House press corps using non-traditional forms of media to deliver their message, to reducing the number of open events and opportunities for questions, to going as far as threatening legal action against journalists for simply doing their jobs. This White House appears more concerned with providing America their carefully scripted version of history, rather than living up to their self-proclaimed motto as the most transparent administration in history. I realize to many of you that this just sounds like a journalist crying over spilled milk, or as Steve said, whining, coming from probably a self-righteous, all too cozy press corps. But we take our jobs and our journalistic responsibilities seriously. We actually believe that the public has a right to see firsthand government officials acting in their public capacity, and that those officials should be willing to answer tough questions asked by journalists about their duties. We do not want to receive handout photos of important meetings between the president and other world leaders with White House talking points attached. Perfectly poised pictures and crafted messages that are better suited for a reality show than actually news coverage of the president. But unfortunately, that is our reality. And more it feels like we're the actors in this ultimate reality show of the Obama presidency. After reading Tony's paper, Todd and I chatted briefly about restrictions placed on the media and intimidation tactics and leaking of sensitive information. And we both agreed that probably neither of our organizations is likely to get a copy of the next generation Pentagon Papers or a mysterious call from a Julian Assange type. Those gets are usually reserved for the likes of the New York Times or the AP or the Guardian. In fact, for television, it's even at a higher bar because we need that on-camera element. And as we all know, Deep Throat didn't seek out a sit-down interview with Walter Cronkite before he talked to Woodward and Bernstein. So the likelihood of me or one of my colleagues getting subpoenaed to turn over information about a story is pretty high. We don't typically worry about wiretapping, though Cheryl Atkinson does, or defending reporter privilege, as James Risen has been forced to do. In fact, I actually can't imagine my telephone calls being subpoenaed in a dragnet, because boy, those NSA guys would be bored. But the reality is that the restrictions and the pressures that the average reporter on the White House beat endures, it's not that overt. It's the silent chipping away of the freedom of the press that's our greatest fear. Thank goodness for organizations such as the Reporters for the Freedom of the Press who do fight those big battles on behalf of working journalists. But our reality is much smaller, more intimate, and more nuanced. In my opinion, the struggle to cover the White House falls into two categories. Number one is the restrictions placed on the press who cover the public duties of the president, and number two, the daily bullying of the media who cover him. What I mean when I talk about coverage restrictions is this. It's the ever-dwindling access that the media has to cover the official activities of the administration. I'm talking about meetings with world leaders, the president signing bills into law, the activities of the Oval Office. Instead, as I said before, we are offered photos of what should be an open event taken by the president's personal photographer. In fact, not too long ago, the media sent a letter to the White House press secretary protesting the ban on the coverage when the president met with people like members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. He met with former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. He met with group leaders like Senators McCain and Graham. He even met with Malala, and we weren't allowed to cover the events, all of which were official functions of the presidency. These were not personal get-togethers in his private residence. Yet they were all closed to the media. Why? These were newsworthy events, the kind of events that the media has traditionally been given access to and used to inform Americans about who the president is meeting with and who is helping inform his decisions, whether making decisions on immigration, healthcare, the economy, or the world. But more and more often, we're denied access, and that's even if we know about the meetings. And then we're handed that official White House photo. Or maybe they do allow coverage, but they do it with still photographers only. That's just, somebody holding a camera. But what they don't allow any editorial presence. So what does this mean? It remains that no reporters are actually allowed in the room, and therefore there is no one there to ask questions about what's happening at home or abroad. I don't understand this. But it appears that the White House doesn't want the media to yell questions at the president or a visiting dignitary, which they consider disruptive or time-consuming. Again, why? The president doesn't have to respond. He can just stand there and smile. And 20 seconds later, we're shuttled out of the room, but we've been there to see who he's meeting with. Now, sometimes the press office does want to play ball. And in those instances, they'll tell the waiting press corps that the president is likely to answer a question if asked on a certain subject. So all of a sudden, then they open up the photo op to a pool of credentialed journalists who run in there, and lo and behold, Mr. Obama will answer a question that's yelled at him. So why aren't all of those types of events open? Well, who knows? But it feels like the White House Communications Office is simply terrified that the president is going to appear unscripted in some way. Instead, they prefer to release those beautifully stylized pictures that portray an idealized version of these events. As the White House press corps calls them, we call them the visual press releases, or more bluntly, propaganda, not journalism. The president has said that, quote, transparency promotes accountability, yet this White House's actions speak louder than words. So now back to my point about bullying of the media. This is the area that really gets me. And it's because, like I said, it's nuanced. It's hard to prove, and we come across sounding like whiners. Therefore, it's much more insidious, because this intimidation cuts two ways. It's intimidation of the source, and it's intimidation of the journalist. These days, government officials are terrified to talk to the media in some cases. Sometimes they won't even discuss unclassified information with reporters, especially if they haven't cleared those talking points through the White House. This DEFCON 4 level of fear has caused even low-level federal staffers to shy away from explaining government programs to journalists, lest they be accused of being the next Edward Snowden. It's really outrageous. But it's not just the federal workers who are intimidated, it's the press corps too. Like I said before, by restricting access to events, unless we agree not to send a reporter to answer questions, that's an intimidation tactic. It's coercion. Play by our rules or get iced out. Other methods. Routinely we receive, curse-laden emails disparaging our reporting. And by the way, those criticisms often come from low-level press officers who just a year ago were setting up porta-pots for journalists on the campaign trail, but now they feel empowered with this West Wing pass to browbeat veteran journalists. They call our bosses when they don't like stories written about the president. They threaten to pull our credentials or insinuate that we'll never get another interview or if we continue down a certain line of questioning. We receive screeching phone calls blasting our pieces as soon as they hit the evening news, day in and day out. Honestly, if I was a reporter for a small paper or a junior television producer, I might be deterred from asking tough questions or critically looking at the administration's policies out of fear of retribution, having my access limited to events or not being called on in a briefing, or just not having my emails returned. Finally, one of the most frustrating and inauthentic tactics that this White House insists upon is hiding behind this term, senior administration official. This one really traps me. For instance, the White House will schedule a phone call right before an overseas presidential trip in order to help the press understand the mission-critical importance of the visit and what the administration hopes to accomplish. Okay, fair enough. Educate us. On that call, we'll have the National Security Advisor and let's say the Secretary of Energy. And each will be made available to brief us and answer questions. Everyone knows who's talking, and those people can be quoted, but not by name. We have to call them a senior administration official. It's the price of admission, and it's intimidation, and it sucks. They even transcribe the phone calls and post them on whitehouse.gov, but they redact the transcript if a reporter uses the person's name when addressing them during the questions. So why don't we just give up, walk away, tell the White House to take a hike? Maybe that would do. In fact, do you know how expensive it is for us to cover the president day in and day out? In Washington or Wisconsin or Western Sahara, coverage of the White House is the largest part of my bureau's budget outside of salaries. In fact, the president's trip to Asia last November cost each of the newspapers and wire services, each of those reporters, close to $100,000 a person for that trip. As my colleagues in the White House Correspondents Association, of which Todd is on the board, rightly complained, they were explaining that they could have hired a full-time journalist for the cost of that trip that unfortunately offered very little access to the president and wasn't particularly newsworthy. So back to why we don't walk away. Again, it's because we believe in what we're doing, the service that we're providing, and the public's right to see the administration through an unfiltered lens. And lastly, I want to address the messengers of intimidation, the people I call the true believers, that frontline army that stands between the press and the president. And I understand that tensions between the press handlers and the journalists go back to the beginning of time, further back than I ever knew. But Larry Speaks, who was Reagan's press guy, was notorious for freezing out reporters. And Ari Fleischer wasn't terribly popular. Jay Carney was incredibly dismissive for a former journalist. But the greatest invectives are reserved for those who aren't the press secretaries, but rather their staffers. This administration is full of these self-important soldiers, who I won't name by name, who are notorious for their aggressive, threatening, insulting, and literal, excuse my French, fuck yous to reporters who dare take issue with the administration's strategy on any given subject. Again, the phone calls, the emails, they're nonstop. They cross the line over and over. But those guys are nothing compared to who I call the pit bull extraordinaire. And I'm only saying his name and giving these stories because you can Google him. You can find it. But Philippe Reines was the former senior advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And Philippe has been Mrs. Clinton's confidant, media strategist, and spokesman for almost 15 years. If she becomes president, he will most assuredly have a huge role in the White House in managing the media. Even now, while she's mulling another run, access to the former secretary is through Philippe. He holds the key. And I bring up Philippe because he's one of the best examples of this new generation of spin doctors who are solely focused on managing their boss's image to the point that they find themselves crossing the line of acceptable behavior in an effort to protect that brand. Two quick Philippe anecdotes. So my current colleague at ABC, his name is Justin Fischel, and he used to work for Fox News. Remember when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton fell and she suffered a concussion? It was just days before the Benghazi hearings. Well, Justin asked the State Department press secretary that day about the coincidence, and basically he was just verbalizing what we were all thinking. What a coinkydink. But by day's end, Justin and the Fox bureau chief had received an email from Philippe, which basically said, "I am so sorry. We owe you an apology. Somehow in today's transcript of the press briefing, it quoted you as insinuating that there were ulterior motives behind the secretary's health concerns." Philippe said, and I quote, "I called them and read them the riot act for putting such misleading, accusatory, and absolutely asinine words in your mouth." He went on to say that no credible journalist would ever ask such a question. So please accept our apologies. Funny, right? Well, Justin and his bureau chief didn't take the bait. But Philippe, being Philippe, went out and did what he does. He leaked that email to the media, who then had a field day with it. That's intimidation. It's also textbook Philippe. This is a guy who famously got into an email spat with BuzzFeed reporter Michael Hastings over CNN's handling of the journal that belonged to the late Ambassador Chris Stevens. Philippe was incredibly abusive in his emails with Hastings, calling him an unmitigated asshole, asking if he only trafficked in lies, or was he on the ground floor of creating them. Eventually, Hastings printed the entire email chain, which famously ended with Reines telling Hastings to, quote, "Have a good day." And by good day, I mean fuck off. If that isn't intimidation, I don't know what is. And if Clinton wins, get ready for much more. But let me be clear, the Republicans have their own Philippes waiting in the wings, ready to hand the mainstream media just more of this if their candidate becomes president. So let me wrap this up. I've complained about access issues and strong armings by the White House. I've stood on my soapbox for freedom of the press. I've given you honest examples of issues facing me and my colleagues, but the fact is times have changed. We realize that technology is changing the way we cover the government and how they want to be covered, and that's good. And we all know that this administration, more than any in recent past, has decided to use the ever-evolving forms of media to circumvent traditional ones to get their message out. For instance, the president, now wants to talk to BuzzFeed instead of Bloomberg, or Vox instead of Fox. He talks directly to local TV stations in Dubuque. He agrees to be interviewed between two ferns. He hosts Google Hangouts, you name it, he's doing it, and he should. But by creating their own new media avenues to connect with citizens, as Professor Smith said in his paper, the White House is walking a dangerously fine line to manufacturing consent through the creation of this quasi-journalism. The president's desire to talk directly to the people shouldn't be a zero-sum game. It shouldn't be either or. Take questions from YouTube star Glozell, but also take them from the New York Times' Peter Baker. Talking to the people, or better yet, having a conversation with them, shouldn't exclude answering questions from informed journalists. Thank you.
Thank you.
All tough acts follow. So thanks for having me. It's great to be back in Dallas. I don't get here often enough. It is especially an honor, I have to say, to be here in the company of Bob Mong, who hired me 25 years ago, long before I needed reading glasses. He saved me from a life of law school and prosperity and drudgery. Also, that was the word that I was looking for. And I want to congratulate Tony and Steve on their hard work and insights. And I apologize that as someone who has spent his adult life in newspapers, getting up and talking in public is not really a natural act, but I'll do what I can. I'm happy to share my perspective as a Washington correspondent who's covered the White House a little bit and then more for the past 10 years. And as Stacia said, I joined the board of the White House Correspondents Association last summer, which gave me a whole new insight into some of these issues. I want to do a little bit of mop-up. We've had a couple of references, Stacia and then Tom DeFrank this morning earlier talked about this incredibly mind-blowing cost when the bills came in from the Asia trip, which unfortunately Bob didn't send me to because we don't do that kind of travel. When the president went to Asia, and it was $90,000 to $100,000. It's a per capita cost, right? So if 100 more reporters had traveled, it would not have been 100,000. Plus, it was Asia, very far away, very expensive to go. But without telling tales, I think we can point to a number of things which we've heard a lot about this morning that explain the low number of travelers which pushed up the per capita cost. The control that the White House exercises, the lack of access, makes it a little bit less enticing to spend enormous sums of money and send even more travelers to these things, when really most of the news you can watch on television, and it's very tempting to just take the feed and cover the highlights and save your outlet, $90,000 a person. So this is a potential death spiral, which we're all working on, the White House Correspondents Association is working on. Some people at the White House are sensitive and aware and concerned, and we're having conversations and we're working on some of that. So my youngest, my 13-year-old, Abigail, was sitting with me last week as I was prepping a little bit for this. She's doing some homework. She looks up, and out of the blue, as far as I was concerned, she asks me if I consider BuzzFeed to be a legitimate news organization. This is a 13-year-old who, let me tell you, doesn't read DallasNews.com, unfortunately. And this is a kid who outgrew the Sunday comics a couple of years ago and I don't think has touched a newspaper ever since. And it was kind of off-putting, but it also sort of clicked with me that it fit exactly with the papers and the topics that we're talking about today. What is a journalist? What is journalism? Is it a status? Is it a set of actions? Is it a distribution channel? And Stacia really, of all of the speakers, and I think a lot of us have touched on it, a lot of you have touched on it, got to this idea. For the moment, let me just embrace all of her comments except for the F-bombs. And
You're welcome.
and the intimidation and the cyberbullying from the White House apart, taking photos, asking questions, taking notes, passing along details of what the president has done, these are all acts of journalism. But when they are not done by journalists, but rather by government operatives, this does not comprise journalism. So, well, I'll get back to that a little bit. I want to talk briefly about WikiLeaks and Snowden, since we're talking about that. And let me preface this by saying no one has ever leaked anything classified to me. I've been in Washington for 12 years. I think the time has come and passed. I don't think it's going to happen. That's not my part of the political industrial complex. But in terms of whether that's journalism, obviously for Snowden, it doesn't matter whether you see him, to me, it doesn't matter if you see him as a hero or as a traitor. What he did wasn't anything close to journalism. Now, the people who worked with him, the journalists, they're journalists, and they have their judgment to bring to the table. I don't know if he thought that he would get away with this without repercussions. Call me old-fashioned. I went to graduate school in public policy. I went to school with a lot of people who were on a track to become government employees and operatives, and we actually talked quite a lot about the ethics of leaking and the duty to leak. And the idea that under certain circumstances, if you worked for the government, particularly the higher you worked in the government, that there were certain times when it was not just a good ethical option, but really advisable and almost unavoidable to leak in the right circumstances, or maybe even to resign in protest. Now, journalists, self-serving, our perspective, hey, leak, great, it's terrific. As Teddy Roosevelt's daughter Alice liked to say, if you don't have something nice to say about somebody, come sit by me. Great. But it's not a freebie. I don't think it's ever been a freebie to be a leaker, to be someone who resigns in protest. They should and should expect to accept some consequences. And you have to hope that you're doing the right thing and that, as Ellsberg was, that eventually you would be vindicated. But as Tony in particular noted, this administration has been especially aggressive in this area. And it was a different equation when you could leak and it would be kind of understood there wouldn't be a full-blown investigation into who the leakers were, because it was kind of a healthy outlet that everyone appreciated. The press appreciated it, people in government, people at the highest levels of government appreciated that this was, in fact, kind of a pressure valve in our system. One more thought about these cases that we've been talking about. We certainly have a better grasp now of the appetites of this surveillance state that we live in, a state that is abetted by all of the GPS-enabled devices that we have in our pockets. Abigail, my 13-year-old, just got an iPhone 6, by the way. She loves it. But she and her generation have a completely different concept of privacy than I do, than Bob does, and Tony and Steve and the rest of us do. They live their lives on the Insta and on Snapchat, and you know, I worry about that. So now to Steve's look at how presidents have used technology through the centuries. Again, let me just make it clear where the Dallas Morning News fits in the ecosystem of the White House press corps. We have a permanent seat in the briefing room, back row. We hardly ever get called on. The last time a president called on a reporter from the Dallas Morning News at a press conference was, I believe, 2006. Now, local TV stations, they get invited in. We've talked a lot about Twitter and Facebook and all the different avenues that the White House uses. One thing nobody's mentioned so far is sometimes local news anchors get trotted into the White House, usually anchors, to ask questions. Sometimes Brad Watson comes to mind. They ask pretty tough questions and they get under the president's skin. More often, they do things like a particular anchor who I won't name and I won't identify, but you could probably look it up too, who tweeted out a day before, golly gee, I'm going to sit down with the president tomorrow and here's what I'm going to ask him. And this is all part of the control that the White House exercises. They are much more eager to have questions from those kinds of questioners than from the likes of us. The last time I actually got to ask President Obama a question I'm embarrassed to say on the record was he had been in office just about 2 months. And he was still doing roundtable discussions with regional newspapers. And so there's 15 of us in the Roosevelt room, and he goes around and he asks us questions. I would point out, and have in fact pointed out to several senior administration officials, that back when the president was doing this, his approval ratings were up here. And he is no longer doing this, and his approval ratings are down here. But they seem much more comfortable with between the two ferns and all of that stuff. So this isn't our problem. This is not just our problem in the press. This is his problem too. The public, and I would argue the loyal opposition, tune out a president who mainly preaches to his choir. And it would be interesting to imagine this alternative universe where a modern president actually engaged publicly with the press more and with his adversaries, but that's not where we are right now. Maybe one day we'll have a president who's skilled at such things. Maybe I don't know, a former national debate champion comes to mind, for instance, Ted Cruz, in case you're interesting. That said, of course, as people have said, of course the White House wants to control things. FDR's fireside chats have been mentioned a number of times. Obama, this guy has 54.9 million Twitter followers. Why wouldn't you use that megaphone, and why wouldn't you prefer that to subjecting yourself to an interrogation from Major Garrett or Jonathan Karl? Of course you do. Personally, I'm not offended by that. I'm not offended by the Between the Two Ferns or the BuzzFeed stuff. Selfie stick, I don't know, you can argue whether that was beneath the dignity of the office. But, you know, why wouldn't a president try to meet the people where they are? I'm not even necessarily offended by West Wing reports, among the many video tools that the White House uses to get its own unfiltered message out there. But the problem is that it's the ratio. And I guess that's part of what a lot of has been said today gets to, is that it's gone too far. It's gone too far for the press. I think it's gone too far for the president. It's certainly gone too far in the lopsided, self-serving, self-controlled propaganda direction. So let me talk for a second about the State of the Union curveball that the White House threw us, which was very interesting, when instead of the traditional embargoed copy of the president's speech, the White House hit send and immediately published it just before the president started speaking, and it was annotated, and you could tweet easily from lines from it. So I was up there in the House gallery. I like to be on the scene, just as when you're in a campaign mode, which I'm already shifting to, by the way. It's good to feel the crowd. It's good to witness things. So it wasn't just that the president bypassed the media by not helping us out and giving us an embargoed copy on a tight deadline. It was a snub. It was a deliberate snub. They could have told us ahead of time, yeah, we're not going to give you an embargoed copy this year. We're just going to release it publicly all at the same time, so prepare accordingly. They could have done that. It wouldn't have cost them anything, but they wanted the element of surprise. They wanted to snub us. Let me say one quick other thing about being an eyewitness to things. There was the mention of I think Olivier showed the tweet when the president said, I run my last campaign, and then the Republicans fell into the trap, they clapped, and he zinged them with, I know, because I won my last 2 races. Being in the gallery allowed me to see, and probably most of you not to see, Michelle Obama was the first person clapping when he said, I've run my last campaign. But it was rapidly drowned out by the Republican cheering on the floor. So it is, in fact, useful to be there in person. So it was a gratuitous snub. It was a poke at the press. They were saying, the White House was saying, you are not as important and relevant as you think you are. And maybe we're not. So let me just finish with this. You can despise the MSM, but ultimately you can't avoid us. So a couple of weeks ago, I was at the Des Moines Marriott before the first cattle call of the Republican of the 2016 Iowa caucuses. 2016 is well upon us. Dozens and dozens of political reporters were there. And Gingrich was there, and Chris Christie was there, and who walks in but Sarah Palin? She hates the mainstream media, right? She makes fun of us all the time. She hates us. Let me just say, she was not in any hurry to get to the elevator. We must still be relevant in some way. And campaigns are still are quickly plotting ways to get around us. And I'm sure that whatever new tricks they come up with now will inform the 45th president and how he or she deals with us, and I dread that. But I can't really blame them, because here we are, everyone in this room, I think, has a smartphone with a video camera. We certainly do. Everybody is a witness. Everybody is ready for the macaca moment or the 47% moment. They're hunting for victory, and they are our prey. We're hunting for their gaffe. So why wouldn't they hunker down? Why wouldn't they hide behind these photo ops where they don't have to subject themselves to the shouted question? But it's a problem, and it's not just a problem for we in the self-interested press corps. Thank you.
Stephen and Tony, you have a chance to respond, or we can go to the floor. It's up to you. Questions from the floor? Sir.
Ms. Deshaku, I was fascinated about your 10-minute diatribe against the Obama administration, especially your gratuitous comment about Philippe and Hillary Clinton's potential run for the presidency. In the last 10 seconds, you indicated that we can expect nothing better from the Republicans. Could you please elaborate on what you see the Republicans bringing, including people in the Jeb Bush potential category of administration?
Sure. I mean, the fact is, the job of spokesman or press handler or communication strategist, I mean, it's a job now. We're teaching it at SMU. And so every party has people who grow up in the party whose jobs are to manage the message and manage the image of their candidate, both sides. On any given night when the president is giving his State of the Union, the Republicans are tweeting out their message and their response coming to you from the RNC or the different groups, interest groups. So everybody has their folks. And I just, like I said, I used Philippe because it's already out there in the media. I didn't want to name any other names. But it isn't about a party. It's about the position, and it's about managing the message and where this industry has gone. Because a lot of folks leave the West Wing and then they go start their own strategic communications firms and take that connection to the White House on to the bank. And they're making lots of money out there. No, not at all.
Sir.
I'll quit the politeness. Mr. Shishku, your whining is highly unpersuasive. The job of the reporter is shoe leather. Find the story, dig out the story, and tell the story. It's not eating at the White House trough and complaining about the menu. The White House has no obligation to hand you the story on a silver platter. And whining about that is just juvenile. Go out and find the story. Woodward and Bernstein did not get their Pulitzer Prizes for face-to-face interviews. They trespassed in a garage to get their stories and protected that man's identity until he outed himself 40 years later. It's not about asking somebody to give you your story. Thank you.
I appreciate your comment.
Does anybody have a question? Ma'am?
Well, I hope I can make sense with this because it's pretty complex. Two things bother me. And I think the first thing is that this entire bevy of people at the White House that are putting out these messages over all of the younger generation media. There must be hundreds of them, and how do they all keep their story straight? It must just be a one-way street where people are saying things to them and they don't put anything out except an official message also, which means all of these people who are in contact with the White House think they have contact but don't. It's a one-way, meaningless relationship of a friendship that's totally one way and they're being fed. Okay, so whereas the journalist is supposed to go and get a story, not exactly fed a story, but has access to actually ask questions and get a meaningful answer. Something that has been perhaps not prepared by the president or whoever, and they have to have a comeback that's meaningful based on what they know. That is apparently not happening. So if that's the case, where can we at some point have any kind of meaningful output between the people who need to know what's going on without having a bunch of information just dumped that's unfiltered, where we feel like now we know what's going on, but we still really don't, because we don't know how to make any sense of all this information that's been leaked. There does need to be something between the two, but I don't think it's allowed in my own view of what you guys are saying, because especially after we had a president who was derided for saying idiotic things to the press in Bush. I mean, he was derided for seeming unintelligent when he talked. Well, then you've got a president who comes who is just afraid, I think, to say anything. And it's not just this president. I wonder if we're ever going to have any more candid speech from the president or any politician like that, because all of the sound bites, they're going to be construed and mixed around, and I think they're all kind of afraid to be candid now and be real people, which we need. We need to hear real people. We need to hear good, interesting, new topics, people that change their opinion without being derided at flip-flopping.
Well,
We've
I think,
lost the humanity.
Can I answer at least part of your point? That there is an enormous message discipline in the White House. And I wasn't around in Clinton days. Supposedly it was a lot, freer and looser. Tom DeFrank could, talk about the arc of this. But there has been a ratcheting up over the years of message discipline, and the key for the really best White House reporters, and I do not count myself among them, but the very best of them know how to find the guy who actually is creating the talking points, as opposed to the minions who are just disseminating them.
I have just one thing to add to that that relates, and several months ago there was a piece in Rolling Stone magazine, and it was written by one of the former Obama press people, and the whole idea was that the mechanism had failed. His thesis was that the reason for Obama's failure in communication is that his handlers have not used the media correctly. It didn't have anything to do with whether the message was any good. It dealt with the failure of the mechanism itself. And to me, that's a real danger in politics going forward.
Jeffrey?
Thank you. I'm a historian, and so I'm trying to figure out what has changed in the new environment versus what we saw in the past. And so I'm actually going to frame my question towards David Demarest, and he can answer when it's his panel. Well, I want to know, sir, David, how many F-bomb-laden emails did you write? And the reason I ask that, and probably not many emails, but conversations, and the reason I ask that is because I can believe entirely the intimidation that you're describing and the White House environment that you're describing of the direct message. But at the same time, you gave an example of transcripts being produced of White House senior officials giving detailed discussions in which their identity is not to be released. Back in my office, I have the exact same thing from the Kennedy administration and from the Johnson administration and from the Bush 41 administration. So if I have this data point, which tells me that nothing has changed, and I have your data point that tells me that the intimidation factor has gone up, how would I know how much it's gone up? And how would I know whether I should be concerned about how much gone up, or is this simply the way the White House has always operated?
I think David and I talked about that. I don't think his administration sent any of those curse-laden emails. I think he can be pretty sure of that. We can all, I think one day, we've talked kind of, some of my journalist friends amongst ourselves saying someone's going to write this book one day. And because all of those are written on government accounts. You know, somebody will be able to FOIA them, and it will be interesting. It will be interesting to see how it has changed because it is real. But what, you know, sometimes with the phone calls too, like I said, they come into the booth in the White House press room, and you just get excoriated on the phone. Okay, thank you very much, and you move on. About the senior administration official, it's just frustrating, I guess. A lot of times those were usually done in the briefing room on the record, maybe in front of the cameras. But more and more, we're just, you know, they get upset with us about anonymous sourcing, and we get upset with them about senior administration official. It's the two sides. Do you agree?
Yes. My favorite are the, not just where the reporters call on the senior administration official by name, but where there are two or more SAOs on the call, and they refer to each other by name. Well, Cecilia made a really terrific point just now, and I want to get back to that. And all of that is excised from the transcripts. To the point about the vulgarity, it would be great to see the emails from the LBJ administration. and we know that Nixon was highly vulgar in the Oval Office, so I don't know about the actual intimidation directly of the press, but it's not like they've all been Boy Scouts.
To stay on schedule, we're going to have to take a break now. Lunch will be served. And if all the conference panelists could please come to the southeast corner of the ballroom over here for a photo op. Thanks.